something I've been thinking about for a while, Mark, is that all we can ever do is find the right diet that works for us at that point in our life, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
And what you're speaking to, and you detail the ProTage study in the book, what it showed, which is very, very powerful. But we're almost making a case, I think, that as we get older, potentially we need to increase our protein intake. Is that something you would agree with?
Absolutely. Even the study that most vegans quote that show that protein is bad for you show that as you get older, it's actually important that you increase your protein intake. So, what people don't understand is that the recommended amounts of protein are the minimum amount to not get a deficiency disease. So how do you not get protein deficiency, which is a very serious disease? You have to eat 0.8 grams per kilo. But that's like how much vitamin D do you need to not get rickets? Probably 30 units. How much vitamin D do you need to optimize your immune system and to prevent cancer and heart disease and all these other benefits? Probably 2,000 to 4,000, maybe 10 to 100 times the minimum amount. Yeah. So I'm not saying you should have 100 times the recommended dietary allowance of protein, but you need more than the minimum amount. And for people getting older, it shouldn't be probably 0.8. It should be more like 1.6. And if you're doing a lot of vigorous activity and strength training, you can even have more. So I think both because there's resistance to the effects of eating protein, meaning you need more protein to get the muscle building effect. And the fact that, as we get older, we need to make sure our protein needs are met. We do need more protein as we get older.
For someone who's listening, Mark, and goes, okay, I understand that. Okay, I'm going to increase my protein a little bit. But I'm not sure about strength training. I like going for walks. I hear you, but I'm not interested in that. I'm not worried about
That was me.
Why is it so important that people don't neglect resistance training, particularly as they get older?
Yeah, that was really, that was me. I hated the gym. It was smelly. I didn't want to go in with all the, big guys who were intimidating and lifting all these heavy weights. And I was a skinny guy. So I just kind of didn't go. And I knew I recommended it because the science was clear, but I was kind of resistant to resistance training. And I decided I was going to do it. And I hit 60. I was like in my 59th year. I was like, okay, I'm going to 59. I probably should get on it now. And I started to do it. And it was really life-changing. And I think that most people don't realize the impact of strength training on your balance, on your mobility, on your function, on your metabolism, on your overall well-being, on your hormones. Sex hormones decline as we age, so strength training boosts those. So it has so many benefits that if you want to live a long, healthy life, aside from cutting out sugar and starch, probably the other most important thing is resistance training. If you just get two things from this podcast, is to understand that you need to dramatically reduce or eliminate starch and sugar from your diet, and to start resistance training in some form. It could be body weight, it could be bands, which I do, it could be weights. But make sure you work with someone to do proper form and so forth, so you don't hurt yourself when you're starting out. But it's so important to do. And there's all these apps, there's YouTube videos, there's no lack of instruction out there, but it is something you should consider essential part of health as you get older. And it doesn't have to be a lot. It can be 30 minutes, 3 times a week. I like to do more, but the reality is I probably only do 3 or 4 times a week because I just don't have the time at this moment. But when I do, I try to do it more and more often. Yeah. But I think the minimum is very adequate. An hour and a half a week. If you don't have an hour and a half a week to invest in your health and what's going on with your life. In fact, I often use this cartoon in my talks where it shows a doctor telling his patient, do you have time to exercise an hour a day or be dead 24 hours a day? So I think that's a funny cartoon.
Yeah. Thank you for the clarity there. I mean, a couple of things there. On Saturday, I tend to go to my local park run, sometimes with my son, sometimes with my family. And at the end of park run this Saturday, I bumped into a friend of mine who said, actually, Ron, I heard your conversation with Gabrielle Lyon. I know Gabrielle's been on your podcast, and she said, I heard it. Yeah. And for the first time in my life, I've actually went and started strength training. She's been doing that for about 2 months. And she said she's in her mid-40s, right? Yeah. And she says she feels absolutely fantastic. She was already really active. She would run, right? She would. So that's in her 40s. But a wider point here, Marcus, and why I've been thinking a lot about strength over the past 2 or 3 months. And again, we can know the science, we can write about it, we can try and practice things, but then sometimes things happen in our lives where the same information lands in a slightly different way. So I've had some real challenges in my personal life over the past 2 or 3 months to do with the health of my mother. And mum is now, I think, sort of 82, 83, and she's been mega unwell since Christmas. She was admitted to hospital. She's come out. She's definitely not the same as she was now. And what's really striking is that, you know, my brother and I try our best to look after her and care for her, but because of her muscle strength, or I should say her lack of muscle strength, basic things now like, you know, getting out of a chair, being able to get out of bed yourself, when you can't do them, the quality of your life can rapidly decline. And I know this, I've seen it with patients before, but when I'm now witnessing it on a daily basis with my own mother, I'm like, Rongan, you need to keep moving. You need to work on your muscle mass. And I think there's a wider point, Mark, which I hope you can speak to, which is this idea that as we get older, our muscle mass is declining, right? So if we don't do anything about it, we're on that road to what I just described. So could you maybe sort of speak to that, inspire people about why they need to get going with this?
Totally. I mean, it starts, you know, when you're younger, you can kind of manage, but when you get into your 30s, 40s, we're not talking 60s, 70s here, we're talking 30s, 40s, you start to decline muscle mass. And unless you are fighting that entropy, by the time you're 60 or 70, you're going to be twice as fat as you were, even though you're the same weight. You will become what we call skinny fat, and your muscle will be replaced by fat. So think of a Wagyu ribeye versus a filet mignon. You want the filet mignon because it's much more functional muscle. And what happens is we lose that muscle and we get a disease called sarcopenia, which is something most doctors don't know how to diagnose, don't test for, and don't treat. But it is among the most important and most deadly things that happen to us as we age. What is a big cause of death in the elderly? Falling, and then breaking your hip. And if you break your hip, it's worse than getting a diagnosis of terminal cancer in terms of your mortality rate. So it's a really big deal. And I think that can be almost entirely prevented by resistance training and giving people the strength to be able to hold themselves up, to fall properly if they end up falling, to have stronger bone density, and all the things we need to do as we get older. So the reason people end up in nursing homes and long-term care facilities is not because they're sick with a chronic disease. It's because they can't get out of bed or get out of a chair or tie their shoes or cut their toenails. And so that's the reason. And that is totally fixable by building muscle as we age and staying strong and fit. I mean, I see, 100-year-old guys riding horses in these blue zones. It's really impressive. Most people wouldn't even go out without a walker at 100 years old, or if they can get up at all, or if they live that long. So we're seeing, the ability to do functional things as the most important thing. Peter Attia is a friend. He talks about the centenarian decathlon. What are the 10 things you have to do? Like get up off the floor. I mean, I went skiing with my dad when he was in his 70s, and he fell in the ski slope. He couldn't get up. He just could not get his body off the ground. And then I helped him by getting him strength training, and I paid for a trainer for him, and he was able to actually start to regain strength even in his 80s, and even up to almost 90 years old. It was very impressive to see.
Yeah, a couple of key messages there. Let's not wait until we're in our 70s and 80s to face those difficulties. Right, the decline is starting already for many of us, so let's do something about it. That was one key message there. The other one was what you said about your father, that even in your 80s, it's not too late. You can make a difference, right? And so I think those are really key points, which again, you make very clear in the book. Mark, talk to me about hormesis. There's a chapter on hormesis in the book. Yeah. What is it, and how can we utilize it, I guess, to help us age better?
Well, I mean, we all evolved in a much more stressful environment. We didn't have perfectly controlled temperatures and humidity and air conditioning and heating, and we just sort of lived out there in nature. And we had periods where we had access to food. We didn't have grocery stores, or periods where we didn't have access to food. And we had to move our bodies a lot just to function. And all these are stresses. So hormesis is essentially a stress that doesn't kill you. and it activates these ancient healing pathways, these ancient longevity switches in your body in ways that we now are fully understanding. And I'll just go through some of them. What's a stress? Well, not eating is a stress. So starvation would be considered a stress. So not eating from 6 o'clock at night to 8 in the morning, your body's like, oh, I'm a little short on food here. That's a stress. Let me kick into gear all these healing systems like autophagy, which we mentioned before. Exercise is another kind of stress. When you lift weights, you're tearing your muscles. When you sprint, you're stressing your mitochondria, and that causes them to rebound and become stronger. Those are two examples of hormesis, but there's a lot of other cool ones that are now being used. Hot and cold therapy. Saunas, for example, show a reduction in death by like 40-something% in Finland in these large studies, and does so by, for example, activating your immune system, by fixing your proteins that are damaged as we age with these products that they're produced in a sauna called heat shock proteins. Or cold therapy, cold plunges. It doesn't even have to be a sauna. It can be a hot bath. It can be a cold shower. Most people have a bath and a shower, so I take a cold shower in the morning for 2 minutes. It's a really inexpensive way to activate hormesis. If you want a cold plunge and splurge on that, great. And those are powerful, but I just, fill my bathtub full of cold water, and if you live in a warm climate, you can throw a couple of bags of ice in, and then sit in there for 3-4 minutes. That activates these healing things in your body. And there are also other forms of hormesis that are phytohormesis, plant foods that have little stress molecules that they make to defend themselves. When we consume those in small amounts, they kind of trigger these healing responses, and many of them through these hallmarks of aging. For example, fisetin, which is from strawberries, helps you kill zombie cells. And quercetin also helps to reverse your biological age, working on your epigenetics and reduces inflammation. So there's all these compounds that we can consume from plants that do this. And then there's some other kind of more advanced therapies like hyperbaric oxygen therapy or hypoxia therapy, where you reduce oxygen levels. These are stresses on the body, and it can actually help to activate longevity pathways. Like in Israel, they did a study on hyperbaric oxygen, and they found that it increased telomeres and killed zombie cells more than any other treatment. And these are things that we see as two of the hallmarks of aging that get worse, and it made them better simply by lying in 100% oxygen at a higher pressure than atmospheric pressure for 60 minutes for 60 sessions over a period of time. So we have real insights into how these stresses can activate these ancient longevity pathways.
Well, you mentioned a couple of terms there that some people may not recognize: zombie cells and telomeres, right? So you mentioned that some of these therapies can help with those two things, two hallmarks of aging, but perhaps you could just expand a little bit on what telomeres are and what zombie cells are.
Yeah. So we mentioned these 10 hallmarks of aging, and then these things that kind of happen as we get older. One of them is, we replicate our DNA, some quadrillion times in our lifetime. And so our DNA has to kind of open up, it has to be read, and then it has to close back up. And that's regulated by these things at the end of your chromosomes called telomeres. As they keep replicating, there's a little bit that gets cut off each time, and they get shorter. They're like the little caps on the end of your shoelaces that prevent it from unraveling. And when they get too short, you end up having problems, and that shortens your life. So telomeres are an important metric to look at as about how we're doing with longevity. The other is zombie cells. Zombie cells are also known as senescent cells. And normally, when cells have gone through their normal process of doing what they do, they die off. And we have a process to do that in our body called apoptosis, which just means you kind of explode the cell and you die and you eat all the parts, and it's sort of a recycling system. But sometimes those cells don't die, and they become zombie cells. And those zombie cells produce all these inflammatory chemicals that go all over your body, and then they kind of make other cells zombie cells, and it creates this whole zombie apocalypse inside and end up with this state of accelerated inflammation. And that's why we call it aging, inflammaging. So senescent cells are things that can be changed or gotten rid of through some things like hyperbaric oxygen or certain senolytic therapies that can be from plant compounds that we can use. So maybe even drugs will be senolytic drugs. We're learning more about this as we go on, but these zombie cells are not good for you, and hyperbaric oxygen can help to get rid of them, which is great.
Yeah. You also, as you just explained, and I really did enjoy reading this section where all these kind of plant compounds can also help us get rid of zombie cells, and you mentioned a few of them there. In that section, Mark, you you wrote quite a provocative sentence.
What's new?
Yeah, what's new? But it really got me thinking. It's quite a beautiful statement, actually. You believe we co-evolved with plants to borrow their medicines to keep us healthy. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. Well, like guinea pigs don't make vitamin C. Humans don't make vitamin C. Many other species of animals do. We don't make it because we're lazy. Our biology, don't want to do anything that we don't have to do with our biology to conserve energy. So we co-evolved with plants to use their compounds as medicines to help regulate our biology. And animals do this. If you see a wild animal or a cow that's pasture raised, they will graze on a few major food crops, but then they'll sample maybe 100 other crops, plants, to actually activate medicinal properties in those plants for themselves. They don't know that, but they kind of intuitively figure this out and keep themselves healthy, which is quite interesting. And so the same thing with humans, we've co-evolved with these plants, and over 800 species of plants as hunter-gatherers that contain these rich phytochemical compounds that we now are understanding that maybe we thought there were 25,000. There may be 1 million of these things in plants. And we're starting to catalog them and understand their mechanisms of action, how they work. When we say food is medicine, that's what we mean. We mean inside the food we're eating, there are medicinal compounds that our body uses to activate various pathways. For example, one of the key findings, for example, around longevity was the activation of sirtuins. Sirtuins is one of the 4 longevity switches that are in the hallmark of aging called deregulated nutrient sensing, meaning how do we sense our nutrition environment and how do we regulate different processes based on whether we're eating the wrong stuff or the right stuff. And so resveratrol, which comes from grapes, actually works on sirtuins to activate sirtuins, which kicks in this whole system of DNA repair and improving insulin sensitivity and mitochondrial function and helping to reduce inflammation. And it's a really amazing thing that happens when you properly regulate sirtuins. Well, resveratrol is a plant compound that is acting on that pathway, for example. Doesn't mean you should be drinking red wine. I want to be careful with that because we now know that alcohol is actually, even in lower amounts than we thought, can be harmful and increase risk of cancer, and is definitely not a health promoting activity. It's fine to do once in a while as a recreational fun thing to do, but it's not something you want to do every day. And I think but the compounds in the red grapes actually do act on this pathway. So that's one example.
Yeah. But then also, I think we have to acknowledge that I'm guessing in these blue zones where you went to, that people are drinking as well, right?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they are. They're having a glass of wine here and there. But, we have to understand that there is a phenomena in science called the healthy user effect. And this means that we can get kind of confused in studies where we say, oh, it seems like people drinking alcohol live longer, or they do this or that. It may be the other things they're doing, right? If we're told that, having a glass of wine is good for you, then maybe the people who are drinking the wine are engaging in other healthy behaviors, right? They're exercising, they're eating more fruits and vegetables, they're not smoking. So we have to be careful of these biases that are inherent in studying people, where we thought, for example, that hormones were protective for women against heart disease and cancer and stroke and dementia because of a population study where they found, women who seemed to take hormones had less of these problems. Well, it was because these women were healthier as a group because they went to the doctor more, they paid more attention to their health, they exercised more, they didn't smoke, they ate more fruits and vegetables. That's why they had less heart disease, cancer, stroke, and dementia. And when they did a randomized controlled trial called the Women's Health Initiative, it was $1 billion study, 160,000 women. They literally had to stop the trial partway through because so many women were dying who were taking the hormones. It's because of the bias in the first study that was called the healthy user effect. And that's what's going on when you look at some of the data. Well, yes, the people in the blue zones drink a little wine, but what else did they do? They weren't exposed to environmental toxins. They had really no chronic stresses. They had deep sense of meaning, purpose, and community. They ate foods that were original, like almost heirloom foods, a lot of wild foods they eat in Nicaria. They had animal foods, but they had animals that were eating all these wild plants that had phytochemicals in them. They had natural exercise that they did as part of their life. So what was it? Was it the alcohol or was it all this other stuff?
Yeah. Thanks for explaining that. I was just bringing that up to stimulate conversation because I think one of the problems when we look at these blue zones is that we, as I've already mentioned, we take these things in isolation. And it's the totality of their experience that leads to it. And we're trying to learn principles. And also the truth is, like in the West, most people, certainly if I speak about the patient population I have seen, most people are consuming alcohol to de-stress, right? So it's a way of mitigating chronic levels of high stress. So I imagine in the blue zones, it's a very different relationship with that alcohol. It's not to de-stress. Maybe it's a small amount to connect, right?
And maybe it's also true. And maybe it's also different. Like in Icaria, they made wine according to their ancient methods. They kind of smushed it with their feet. The grapes were grown in tough soils, so they were much higher in phytochemicals. They didn't have any sulfites. They kind of fermented them in these clay pots underneath the soil, and sometimes it didn't work out, and they were all organic. There were no pesticides, so who knows? It was quite different. I actually drank the wine in Icaria, and I was like, normally wine makes me feel like crap. I just get brain fog and feel kind of off. And I drank this wine. I felt great. I was like, wow, this is really different. But it's not wine that you can actually even take home with you because, they can't ship it. They can't really bottle it. It's really served fresh. It's very different.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to be clear, none of us are, as medical doctors, are promoting alcohol consumption. We're just having a conversation about how these things may influence health and longevity.
Listen, if you want to climb 5 miles on a rocky mountain every day, if you want to sleep 8-9 hours, if you want to have no chronic stress, be exposed to no toxins, have a deep sense of community, meaning, and purpose, and eat like only heirloom traditional foods that are completely unprocessed, you probably can have a glass of wine. It's not going to hurt you. So I think just be careful of all the other things. Yeah.
Mark, coming back to nutrition, it's a very confusing topic for many people, right? And I'm always conscious that I never want to leave people at the end of these podcasts more confused. And I think sometimes that does happen because you speak to someone who may have a certain food philosophy and you speak to someone else with another food philosophy, and they sound very knowledgeable and they quote research to support their point of view. And so in the interest of moving this forward for people, right, let's just go through what everyone can agree on. We started off this conversation talking about reducing ultra-processed foods. I don't think there's many people in this space who would disagree with that, right?
No, I don't. I think that's a universally accepted thing that we should. And that sugar and starch in general are really not great for you. I think most people also agree about that.
Excess sugar, for sure. I think most people can agree with. We're eating way more than we used to, and reducing it, eliminating, I think, is pretty hard for most people in the current environment. But reducing
unless you're type 2 diabetic and you're really overweight, and your metabolism is so screwed up, those people I think do probably need to be on an extremely restricted carbohydrate diet. But once you're metabolically healthy, you can eat more and be more resilient, and that's the goal.
So then the third thing, I think we discussed protein. Now, yes, it's controversial. And it is, as you even admit in your book, it is confusing for people. There's a line where you actually say that. So you understand the confusion. But the ProTage study, which was very thorough, does seem to support increased protein intake to help us prevent sarcopenia, particularly as we get older. And I think you've very eloquently explained your view is that actually it's easy with animal protein, but if you want to do it with plant protein, you can do it. You're going to need to supplement. You may need to make sure you're hitting that 2.5 grams of leucine. So I think, again, broad agreement there, I would say. Would you agree with that?
I agree. And I agree. In terms of plant proteins, you have to make sure that you add extra amino acids or that they're added already to the plant protein. And you have to probably take a plant protein powder, which is pea protein or other forms of protein that may be, pumpkin seed. There's good protein powders out there, but they're not going to be sufficient on their own unless they have added amino acids to bring the leucine content up to 2.5 grams per serving, which is, about 30 plus grams. Okay,
great. And then let's move on to a term that you have said on numerous occasions in this conversation, previous podcast conversations, which is phytochemicals or phytonutrients, right? And these are compounds that are found within plants. Now, I think there's broad consensus that phytonutrients are probably helpful for us, right? I don't think there are a couple of people I follow online.
The carnivore community thinks those are toxins in plants, but I don't quite agree. technically they kind of are, right? The phytochemicals in plants are the plant's defense systems. But as I said, a little bit of stress, a little bit of phytochemical hormesis actually helps our own biology work better.
Yeah. So, and I think another, somewhere that I think people get confused with phytochemicals is that they don't understand the way in which it works in the body. They sort of break it down into the constituents. Like they'll look at a food and go, well, how much fiber, how much protein, how much fat, how many carbs. If you go to the supermarket, you don't see the phytonutrient numbers on the back, right? But
you should.
Well, yeah, and maybe that's the way we'll move at some point in the future. But I wonder if you could just really expand on that. Why are phytonutrients so important in your view? And we need to move beyond this kind of fat, protein, carb model to really understand that, because it's to do with signaling our genes, isn't it?
Totally. I mean, I think the thing that we've missed is that, nutrition, we look at a reductionist view, what is needed: amino acids, fatty acids, carbohydrates, some vitamins and minerals. And it turns out that, you can give people nutrition through an intravenous tube, which contains all these elements. But what is missing is a lot of the stuff that actually really is necessary for health, which are these things that were not considered essential nutrients, but that I consider essential. They're not necessarily going to give you a deficiency disease if you don't eat them. But if you don't eat them over a long period of time, chronic disease will accelerate and you won't protect yourself against all these ravages of aging. And I think this is such an important concept for people to understand, that these are medicines in food. And I have a whole chart in the book about how different compounds in food, whether it's certain classes of foods like onions and garlic, which have quercetin, or other foods like the broccoli family that has glucoferrin, which is important for longevity, or whether it's certain, phytochemicals in green tea like catechins that activate different pathways, or the mushrooms that have polysaccharides that regulate immunity. I go through all the different foods that we can choose from the grocery store, what I call the pharmacy, Pharmacy, and we can use those foods as a part of our daily consumption to activate some of these longevity pathways and switches. So it's not hard to do, but it's important that we consider that these compounds are really essential for us if we want to have vibrant health.
You mentioned the carnivore community, which is growing. And I think it's something that, doctors like ourselves should be talking about, because a lot of people are saying, I've tried everything, and since I went carnivore, so for people who are not familiar, basically pretty much an all meat diet is the way I think many people practice it. And they are reporting all kinds of improvements, joint pain, skin, weight loss, vitality, vibrancy, right?
Sure.
So I want to, with sensitivity and compassion, sort of tease this out a little bit, because on one hand, and this is my view with any patient, you cannot blame anyone for doing something where they've made a change and they feel better, especially when what they tried before did not make them feel good.
Agreed,
right?
100%.
So what
100%.
do you think is going on for people in that community? Obviously, you don't know every single patient there. And where does the phytochemical story come in for those people, would you say?
Yeah. So, the truth is that there are therapeutic diets that can be applied in different patients that need different things. So do I think everybody should be on a keto diet? No. Do I think it's therapeutic diet that can be very effective for some people? Absolutely. Do I think carnivore diet is the diet we should all be on? No. Do I think it could be effective for certain people? Yes. And part of it is not the meat that they're eating, it's what they're not eating, right? They're not eating sugar. They're not eating processed food. They're not having gluten. They're typically not having dairy. They're not having any of the typical processed inflammatory foods that are causing so many of the symptoms. So, for example, if you get off grains and beans, you're removing a lot of things that potentially are bothering people's gut. And not that grains and beans are bad, but for certain people, they are, right? So if you have an autoimmune disease, if you have leaky gut, if you have various inflammatory problems, it may be a real factor. So I often will put people on a more restricted diet in order to reset their biology and see what's working and what's not. And we call that in functional medicine an elimination diet. So a carnivore diet, in a sense, is a very extreme elimination diet with one basic food group. Now, the truth is that, you can get phytochemicals from animal foods if you eat regeneratively raised animals or wild animals. In Icaria and Sardinia, they were taking their goats and sheep and they were taking them to eat all these different wild plants at different times of the year because they knew, not because it had phytochemicals, they knew it would taste better if it had this plant or that plant at this time of the year, that the milk and the meat would taste better, the cheese would taste better. Flavor always follows phytochemical richness in our food. So where our flavor comes from, other than the additives, is from the colorful compounds in the food, like a ripe tomato or, a nice juicy peach in the summer, or something that is from, asparagus just picked from the garden, tastes way different than asparagus you buy in the store. These are because of the phytochemicals in them. But when you are eating a carnivore diet, you're eliminating most of the things, but you are maybe getting some phytochemicals in the food. You're also getting, fatty acids. And if you're eating the right kinds of meat, you're getting some omega-3s. You're getting lots of nutrients, zinc. You have to probably eat organ meats to get all the vitamins that you need. So there's some tricks to it. But I think that it is a pretty interesting way of thinking about treating lots of different conditions that are inflammatory. And I'm not opposed to it, but I don't think it's a long-term strategy. And when you look at our biological needs, we need small amounts of essential fatty acids, in the gram level. There is no biological requirement for carbohydrate, but there is a large requirement for the macronutrient protein. It's the only one for which there's a large requirement as part of our diet. So I think people can do fine on that. I worry long-term, but it's about looking at the numbers. What does your numbers look like? I just saw a patient the other day who was on it and their cholesterol went crazy. So there may be individual responses that are quite different, even to the same diet. And I think that's what people need to understand. There's no one size fits all. There's not, vegan diet's great for everybody or carnivore diet's great for everybody. It's really about what's great for you, what works for you. And that's, as a physician, what my interest is not in, research studies with thousands of people. It's like, what is happening to that person in front of me? And let's do what we call an N of one experiment. Let's try whatever you want to try, or let's try what I think might be best based on the research. And let's measure again how you do. Yeah. If you get better, great. If you get worse, let's change our strategy.
Yeah, I think that was a beautiful breakdown and sort of very similar to my view on it, which is it's a phenomenal elimination diet. The case study of psoriatic arthritis, which you mentioned earlier on in this conversation, again, the principle was you put that patient on a very strict elimination diet to help them because they were sick. And, maybe a year down the line, 6 months down the line, as they rebuild their body, they rebuild their gut lining, potentially they can start to reintroduce things, right? We see that all the time. And I guess, phytochemicals aren't just in your broccoli and your asparagus. Green tea, black tea, right? The herbs that you might put on the cooking, right? They all contain these, turmeric, curcumin, all this sort of stuff. Do you know what I mean? There's other ways people can get that, even if they are on quite a restrictive diet.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, totally.
Yeah. Mark, there's a point there, as you mentioned, the elimination diets, and I'd really welcome your thoughts on this. These days, for most people, is it more important to focus on what to bring into your diet, or is it more important to focus on what to take out of it?
That's a great question. I think, I think it's both. I mean, you have to add in all the good stuff and you have to take out the bad stuff. I mean, if you're eating, 3 cups of broccoli a day, but having 3 Coca-Colas, I don't think it's going to do the same thing as if you get rid of the Coca-Colas and eat, more whole foods. So I think we do need to get rid of stuff, and we also need to add stuff. So they're both really important. I think the key is trying to include more and more of the things that are good for you and slowly eliminate things that are bad for you. And I think people can get there. Now, what I often recommend, because if you do the incremental approach, you might not see the benefits as fast, is a short-term 10-day reset. And I call it the 10-day detox diet. I've written a book about it. It's sort of highlighted in a little bit in the book about how to do that. But the key is when you kind of remove all the bad stuff, potentially bad stuff, because it may not be bad, right? Gluten may not be bad for everybody. But if you remove all the stuff that potentially is bad for 10 days, your body will get the chance to reset. And what I've seen by doing that there's a 70% reduction in all symptoms from all diseases in 10 days. That's migraines, irritable bowel, depression, arthritis, whatever it is, gets better in 10 days. Now, if it doesn't get better, maybe something else is going on. Maybe you have Lyme disease or mercury poisoning or something else causing it. But most of the time, a lot of the ailments that we're suffering from are because of what we're eating, and a short-term reset can be extremely powerful. So you can do an incremental approach if you want, but I encourage people to do a reset, because then you go, oh, shoot, I didn't realize how much food was affecting how I feel. Yeah. And how much better I can feel in so few days. It's not like months or years of doing this to see a result. It's literally days.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really like in the new book, Young Forever, Mark, is that there are some complex things in there if you have the resources and you're able to access them. But the majority,
yeah,
are simple things that we can all do. You explain the science, the science can be complex. It's really interesting to read about it, but actually the practical takeaways are actually not that difficult. And, one thing that people will often say, and we'll probably get comments on this video on YouTube, that yes, but it's hard for us to find a doctor like you, Mark, or a doctor like me who looks at these root cause solutions for people. And the one thing I try and emphasize is that 80% of what I'd end up doing anyway is the stuff that we're talking about, right? So get stuck in and do this basic stuff first: your diet, your movement, your sleep, your stress. Do you know what I mean? And if that doesn't work, then we can go in deeper.
Yeah, and in the book, I go through, okay, well, there's quizzes, so you can identify where your imbalances are, what's going on with you. You can be someone who can self-diagnose what's happening. And then there's guidelines about, what are the specific extra dietary changes or extra supplements that might help, or other things that could be necessary, or even further testing or medical care. So there's a roadmap for you to be the CEO of your own health, to dive deep into the things that are out of balance and to correct those things, not just live longer, but to actually feel better now.
A couple of things I wanted to cover before we ended, Mark. One was, you just mentioned the 10-day detoxification diet that you sometimes, you've written a book about it, you've spoken about before. Now, the term detoxification is something that seems to people get triggered by that term. Let's put it like that, right? So,
it's like means you like to go to rehab, right?
Yeah, but if we think about it, people understand the term hangover. They understand, right? If they toxify themselves with too much alcohol, they're going to get symptoms. And they also understand that, if I have a hangover and I drink more water, or instead of having fatty fried foods, and let's say if I have more whole foods and fruits and vegetables, for example, then I'm going to feel better more quickly, right? So I think that's a really simple way for them to understand, yes, detox organs exist, but you can enhance the way that they work by what you're putting in. So for people who are pushing back when they hear you say detoxification, I wonder if you could explain what you mean by it and why it's so important.
Well, if people don't believe in detoxification, then you should basically not pee, not poop, not sweat, and not breathe, because those are all the ways that our bodies are naturally designed to eliminate.
But Mark, on that, people will say, Mark, yes, but they're all working for me. So why do I need to focus on detoxification? My body will do that naturally. So what do you say to that?
It's true. Your body does have these natural systems, but we do everything to impede them, right? We are overloading our metabolisms with bad food. We're not eating enough fiber, and our guts are often messed up. We're often not drinking enough water and eliminating. Our liver pathways aren't optimized to detoxify all the chemicals that we're consuming from our foods and our environment. And so we need to help boost them a little bit. And I think most of the science around detoxification is very clear. We have these detoxification systems. They're often not working well, and we need to increase their function in order to be healthy. And the other kind of connotation of detox means get rid of the bad stuff, right? So yes, it does mean detox from sugar and processed food and so forth. So there's both the sort of, the sort of hard science of our detoxification organs and systems and how to optimize those. But there's also the the reality that we're eating a lot of crap and we need to get rid of it. And that's another sort of way of thinking about it.
You mentioned, Mark, biological age and chronological age.
Yes.
Please explain for people who don't know the difference.
Sure. So, I'm 63. I can't change that. I was born in 1959, and that's going to progress inevitably toward, however many years I'm alive. However, my biological age is my age on the inside. It's not my chronological clock. It's my biological clock. And we now know that we can measure our biological clock and our rate of aging through a specific test called DNA methylation. It's something relatively new, and it tests what's called our epigenome. Our genes are fixed. We have 20,000 genes. We can't change that, or 25, whatever. But we have on top of those genes a regulating system. Epi means above. And the epigenome basically is like the piano player that plays all the different keys, which are our genes. We've got 88 keys, but they can play thousands of tunes. You can have rock, ragtime, jazz, blues, whatever, classical, all in the same 88 keys. Same thing with your epigenome. And it can control your biology in real time in ways that either accelerate or reverse the aging process. And now we know that a lot of the interventions that we discuss, whether it's diet and exactly what to eat, how to eat, and so forth, exercise, the types of exercise, stress reduction, sleep, environmental toxins, nutritional level, our microbiome, all these things influence our epigenome and can change it either into something that's causing us to age fast or slow, or reverse our biological age. So if you're eating ultra-processed food, you're not exercising, you're under tons of stress, you're not sleeping, you're nutritionally deficient, you're exposed to toxins, guess what? Your epigenome is going to be bad. You will be older than your chronological age as opposed to younger. So we know through interventions, even short interventions of, for example, 8 weeks, of aggressive lifestyle and dietary change with functional medicine, you can reverse your biological age by 3 years. So in 8 weeks, you turn back the biological clock by 3 years. That's profound.
In 8 weeks?
In 8 weeks, yeah.
And
so,
I mean,
I'm 43. I'm trying to get to 25. We'll see how it goes.
but I think that's a key point here, Mark. When a lot of people think about longevity, right? I think there is a slight mismatch in their brain where it's like, well, why should I be bothered about what happens in 20, 30 years? I want to live my life now, right? So there's always been this slight disconnect. Whereas what I love about the things that you recommend in Young Forever is that, yes, it's going to slow down the aging process if that's your goal, but it's also going to help you feel great, straight away, right? So it's not something that we can kick down as the future. It's going to have an immediate impact on the quality of your life.
Immediate. Yeah, absolutely. Adding more life to your years, not just years to your life, right? So how do you actually feel good to do what you want in life? That's what this is all about. How do we be a more engaged society? How do we become more connected to each other and supportive? How do we actually change this sort of this inexorable sickness, both biologically and psychologically, that we see in our society? And a lot of it has to do with our biological health. We know that our mental health is connected to our physical health. And a lot of the sort of raging depression and anxiety and mental health issues that are exploding across the globe are really related to, our overall stress as society, but also to the food we're eating. That literally the dietary things that we do drive our poor mental health. And that particularly starch and sugar and processed food. And that can be changed. And that'll give us a sense of purpose and meaning and ability to do whatever we want.
You posted a photo on, I think it was on Instagram a few months ago, of you in your 40s and you now in your 60s, right? And there was quite a noticeable difference. Right?
There was, yeah.
I think if people didn't know, they may not be sure which one was which. I think you can tell which one's which from looking at your face.
I had a little more gray hair.
But why did you post that? What was so important for you to show people?
Well, I think two things. One, when I was in my 40s, I was athletic. I was running. I was biking 100 miles. I was very active. And I was eating what I thought was healthy, which was whole foods, but I tended to eat a lot more carbohydrates, a lot less fat and less protein. And I didn't do resistance training. I thought, I'm doing yoga, that's good enough, or I'm doing, biking or running. And I didn't. And so when I was 60, I decided to start doing resistance bands and strength training. And I also have changed my diet over the years to be much more low glycemic, to be higher in protein and fat, and lower in starch and sugar, with lots of phytochemically rich fruits and vegetables. And I noticed my body composition change. I went from 12% body fat to 6% body fat. I had, increasing health and strength as I got older, which I think most people don't see. They see, as you get older, you lose muscle, you become more flabby, and that is truly usually what happens. And that is the death knell. If you want to age fast, then don't exercise and keep your diet high in starch and sugar and low in protein and fat. And that's the recipe for disaster. It's really the recipe that most of us are following. But the body has the ability to, as I showed in that picture, to change radically at any age. So I've seen people, even at 80, 90 start to do things, and you see their strength and their function come back.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely, if you're willing to send me that photo, we'll definitely pop it up on the video to show. Because I think it's very inspiring for people. And I think there's a wider point there, Mark, which is, again, if you go down the street and you picked 10 people at random and asked them, would you like to live longer? I suspect that many of them will say no, because they perceive old age with frailty and morbidity.
Yeah.
And I think your book's really challenging that. But can you speak to that a little bit? I think you've written in the book that actually what we see around us is actually what you call abnormal aging.
Yeah. Well, we've come to expect the typical person who's older as representative of what's supposed to happen, right? We become hunched over, weaker, more frail, less able to do the things we want to do. We become fraught with diseases, and over probably 80% of people over 65 have one or more chronic illnesses. And we come to expect this is just how life goes, and we can't do anything about it. But what we're actually witnessing is an accelerated process of aging that has to do with these underlying hallmarks of aging that go awry, and things like damage to our mitochondria, inflammation, change in our microbiome, change in our nutritional sensing apparatus that regulates our food and metabolism, our DNA damage that happens, epigenetic changes, shortening telomeres, zombie cells that develop. So all these things happen as a result of damage to our proteins, happen as a result of this abnormal process that now we can intervene in. And a lot of longevity scientists are looking for drugs or interventions to interrupt these hallmarks of aging, which may be helpful, like rapamycin, for example, or metformin. But the reality is that we have a far greater influence through dealing with the root causes of those hallmarks, what I call dying of too much or dying of too little, which is not enough of the good stuff and too much of the bad stuff that we're exposed to. That all influences these hallmarks, and then we don't actually have to actually treat them individually. We can optimize our health, and our mitochondria will be better. Our blood sugar regulation will be better. Our inflammation will be less, and everything tends to work better when we deal with those root causes of the hallmarks. So we don't have to accept this decline in decrepitude and frailty as normal. We can reverse that. We can reverse that biological process and actually get younger as we get older.
I know as part of the research for this book, you went on your travels. I really enjoyed watching you sharing a lot of these stories on your social media. This is probably, 6-9 months ago. I can't remember when exactly. I know 2 countries you visited, or 2 places you visited, were Sardinia and Icaria, I think.
Icaria.
And I wonder, could you paint us a picture of maybe some of the older residents who you met who really challenge that modern assumption that as we get older, we're going to be frail, we're going to be sick, we're going to be sat down all day, we're not going to be doing much? Because, you shared yourself in your early 60s how much vibrancy you have. Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah. But paint us a picture from your travels as to, a couple of people who you met who also showcased to us what may be possible as we age.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point that, we need to sort of look at cultures where they live a long time and what are their habits and behaviors and how are they different. And I think, they age very well and live a long time. And now the blue zones are these places around the planet where people are the longest lived humans. The thing is, when they move to the Western societies that that we come from, they age at the same rate as we do. They get old and sick and die sooner. And so really by default, their habits are those that promote longevity. They're not, doing saunas and cold plunges and taking a lot of supplements and doing IV and AD and doing exosomes and plasmapheresis and all these kind of cool things that are emerging around longevity. Their whole default culture is actually automatically providing them with the inputs that enhance health and promote longevity. For example, their diet is incredibly rich in phytochemicals, in whole foods, and things that are wild and really simple foods that they've eaten for thousands of years.
We'll be back to the conversation in just a moment. Now, many of us struggle to find time to eat all of these incredible whole foods. That's why I'm a big fan of good quality whole food supplements like this one that's been in my own life for over 3 years now. It contains over 75 whole food source ingredients, vitamins, minerals, pre and probiotics, and it can help us support our energy, focus, digestion, and our immune system. Athletic Greens are giving my audience a fantastic offer. 1 year's free supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first order. You can see all the details at athleticgreens.com/live more, or simply click on the link below. Now, back to the conversation.
They exercise as a normal part of their life, whether it's gardening or whether it's shepherding and climbing up and down the mountains all the day long. And it's the social connections and the tight-knit family groups and the social fabric and the idea that we should just be there to help and support each other is really quite important. And so when you have these defaults, longevity happens as a natural consequence. They actually were quite incredible. I met this guy, Pietro, who was 95 years old. They just retired, quote, retired from being a shepherd, where he was shepherding his sheep 5 miles up and down the Rocky Mountains every single day from probably when he was like 12. And it was straight up as an arrow, booming voice, clear eyes, just looked like the average sort of probably 67-year-old in America. And I'm like, wow, this guy's 95 years old. It was Aleka, who was almost 90 years old. This woman cooked us a meal from her garden. She took care of this entire, I wouldn't call it a garden, more like a farm. She had on a hillside all these orchards and fruit trees, many, many garden beds, animals she took care of. And she did it all by herself. Her husband was like 100, so he was sort of chilling. But she just was so fit, and I was literally chasing after her, going up this hill, huffing and puffing, and she just was like a little mountain goat. I was like, holy cow, this is impressive. And she cooks all her own food. They graze all their own food. She cans all her own food. She preserves all her own food. And she's like 90-some years old. I'm like, this is not what we see in America, 90 years old. We see people in nursing homes or sitting in a wheelchair or rocking chair and not doing a whole lot.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear that, Mark. And I'm just wondering for you, you're someone who's known the science that's come out of the blue zones. You've spoken about it before. You've known about this for many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
Was it different? You can know it with your rational mind, but then you show up and you spend time with these people, these families, these elderly individuals who are maybe more active than you are potentially, and going up mountains, right? What did that do to you? How did that influence your writing of this book? Because I always think about this as you, like me, as someone who we try to communicate these ideas in a simple way to the public.
Yeah.
And we can know stuff with our rational brain, but I think there's something quite powerful about stories and actually seeing people who embody what we actually want, right?
Totally. I mean, it just was so inspiring about what really matters in life. It's not being on your cell phone or being on social media or achieving something or having some great goals. It's about just the process of living. And they did that so well. They really lived close to the earth. They lived close to each other. They celebrated together. It was just quite amazing. You didn't see any nursing homes. If somebody's spouse died, they would move in with their kids or their niece and nephew. I mean, there was one woman, Julia, she was 100 years old and 3 months. She said, I'm 103 months. I'm like, okay, like I'm 5 3/4, when your little kid says that. And she's like, I'm 103 months. And, she didn't have kids of her own. She wasn't ever married. All the men she was dating when she was younger all died off. And she lived with her niece and nephew, and they were taking care of her. There was no sense that they would be putting someone in a nursing home. And she was still working at 100 years old. She was sewing all these doilies and embroideries for weddings and different celebrations. And so she was very active. She'd go on walks every day. And, she really didn't have any health issues. I think her thyroid was a little slow. So she maybe took some thyroid medication, but she was quite amazing and clear-eyed and sharp and funny as heck.
Would you say since coming back from your travels, seeing people like that, has it inspired you to change anything? Are you more active than you were before? You've always been very conscious about your health. So
yeah,
I'm just so fascinated by what that experience did to you on a personal level.
Well, it was just profoundly moving and inspiring. And it made me realize that, a lot of the things that we value in our Western culture are not the things that really matter. And, what matters is our friendships, our community, our connections, is taking care of each other, is taking care of the earth, is actually living in a way that's not harmful to ourselves or everybody else. And that's how they lived. And they lived that way for thousands of years. And they sort of naturally developed these environments and habits that fostered health and longevity. And so as much as I can, I try to learn from them and incorporate some of the habits they have. And it's beautiful for me.
I've read every page of the new book, Mark. And as I say, I really like it. I think it's going to help a lot of people. And we're going to talk about a bit more on food and exercise and protein and stress. We're going to get to all of that. But I wanted this will surprise you. I think for me, through the lens at which I look at life now, I think the most powerful sentence in the book is this one.
Ooh.
In places like the Blue Zones, people seem to understand their place and purpose in the community in which they live. Now, Mark, when I read that, I paused because it really speaks to so much of what I try to write about in my book on happiness, how I think about the world now. You've touched on this a little bit in a couple of ways, Mark. You've said that these guys aren't doing cold plunges. They're not like thinking about their diet. They're not trying to practice anti-aging. Their environment just kind of supports them so that they live well, right? And I remember I haven't been to these so-called Blue Zones, right? But last summer, I was in Ithaki, small island in Greece with my family. And we were there for about 5 days. It was this beautiful small island. And there's so many things I remember. There was one family restaurant which we would go to most days, very small. It was all local foods. The families helped out. It was 3 or 4 generations all around the entire time. And I remember once, Mark, I think my kids were getting a bit tired of the same vegetables every night. So they said, Daddy, have they got broccoli? So I said, hey, and I think I shared this once on the podcast before. I asked the lady who was serving us, do you have any other vegetables, for example, like broccoli? And she looked at me. She was super nice. She was almost with a look of confusion. She said, oh, that's not in season. Like it was, and it was such a powerful lesson. I thought, actually, what they're feeding us is literally what is in season and being grown on that small island. So that was a very powerful lesson. But the overwhelming sense I got was that these guys aren't searching for status. They're not trying to necessarily compete, or certainly from what I could see in a way that I think we are in the West. They're not striving. And as I say, why that phrase in the book, it's so powerful. People seem to understand their place and purpose in the community in which they live. I think that's a big problem for many of us in the West. And I think that is getting in the way. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, think about, when you look at some of the data, it's a little startling. If you were to erase heart disease and cancer from the face of the planet, we would maybe extend life globally by 5 to 7 years, these are the number 1 and 2 killers. If you have meaning and purpose, your life extension is 7 years. So having meaning and purpose in your life, meaning that you know who you are, why you're here, what you're doing, what your place is in the community and connection to others, that actually is a benefit as great as eliminating heart disease and cancer from the face of the earth. I mean, think about that for a minute.
Yeah. And I guess these would be seen as the sort of soft things, right? Real health is about food, protein, movement, right? But a bit of meaning and purpose on the side. But that kind of data you just shared shows that actually it's not the soft stuff on the side. It's at least equally as important, if not potentially more important.
Totally. Actually, I think people think of it as soft, but it's not really soft. It's actually hard science. We know the ways in which stress and being isolated, being disconnected, not having meaning and purpose, being lonely, these are extreme risk factors, as great as smoking, for example. And if you understand the way in which this process of stress affects our biology, you will understand that it works through these hallmarks of aging. It works through, for example, our epigenome, through our environment, through our thoughts, our feelings, our relationships, all the things we just talked about. That influences the epigenome to age faster, to cause more heart disease, more cancer, more diabetes, more dementia, because it's affecting so many of these processes. Stress causes inflammation. Stress causes your nutritional regulation to be affected, and you'd be more likely to be pre-diabetic. It affects your mitochondria. It affects your microbiome. Your microbiome is literally listening to your thoughts. And if you don't say nice thoughts, your bacteria don't like it, literally. So we now understand that this is not some abstract idea, that stress isn't some nebulous thing, that it actually is a real phenomena that's translated into biological signals that either can create health if you are connected and have purpose and meaning, and learn how to regulate your stress response, which is a big part of longevity, as important as anything else that we do.
I read in the book that over the past couple of years, since COVID hit and there were restrictions in place, you shared that you actually reached out to your close male friends to have regular Zoom meetings.
Yeah.
It was quite powerful reading that, because you've obviously known this science for many years.
Yeah.
But that was you really on a practical way going, wow, I need my male buddies. I need to stay connected to them. What's that done for you, would you say?
Oh, it's been profound. I think, in Okinawa, when people are born, they're put in a moai, which is like a little group of friends. And you basically go through your whole life with this small group of friends that are there throughout your childhood, through your adolescence and your early adulthood, all the way through to very old age. And they know you, they love you, they are there for you. They're not there because you're this one or that one, or if this success or that success, but they're your basically soul family in a sense. And for me, I think I realized that this is such an important piece of my happiness and my well-being, is being connected to those I care about and I love. And so I reached out to friends I've had for 40 plus years, in some 25, some 35, but long-term friendships who know me well. And I said to them, hey, it's COVID. I'm going through a bit of a rough time. I'd love to sort of maybe get together maybe other week for maybe an hour. Are you guys up for it? And they're like, no, we want to do 2 hours every week. And we've been doing that for over 2 years now. And it's been a profound change in my life, where you have an opportunity with people who know and love you to be seen, to celebrate the things you want to celebrate, to hear the challenges in your life, to be there for each other, to call each other out, to support each other, really hold each other accountable. And it's such a beautiful, magical thing. And I wish it on everybody. And if you don't have that, it takes time and it takes effort, but it's worth building, because it really forms the foundation of a good life, even if it's just one or two other people.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I really did enjoy that chapter in the book where you spoke about the importance of purpose and meaning. And I think you were sharing that optimistic people live longer, even if they're wrong. I'm pretty sure I read that this morning. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Optimists live longer even if they're wrong. So it's really your mindset that I talk about in the book, and how important your mindset is and your beliefs. Ellen Langer did an incredible study years ago where she put people who were, older in a house for a week. Or maybe I forget exactly how long it was. It was not that long, and everything in the house was sort of basically historical. It was taking them back to a time when they were young adults. So let's say in the 50s. So they had magazines from the 50s, and the TV was from the 50s, and all the furniture was from the 50s, and their whole environment was basically as it was when they were younger. And when they then measured objective metrics of longevity aging, their grip strength and their fitness level and all these weird things. They found that they actually got younger just by believing they were younger. By acting as if they were younger. So, I think it's important to realize that we actually have an important role to play in our health and our longevity through the power of our minds and our beliefs and our mindset. And so there's a bunch of suggestions and ideas in the book about how do we get our mind right? How do we reset our mindset to a positive mindset that can help us to achieve health and longevity?
I think that speaks to this wider point which we've been making, which is if we think that getting older means more frailty and more morbidity, well, it's sort of going to be our reality because that's what we're expecting to happen. We know there's a lot of research on that, your mindset, your thoughts, as you're saying, and I think that's why your book and this movement is important. It's very, very important because it challenges those kind of preconceptions, which is you're sharing from your journeys, need not necessarily be the case, right? So I think that's a really, really key point. I want to talk about protein, Mark. Protein is something you've written a lot about, and I know it's a divisive topic, right? So I wonder if you could help walk us through it. And, you shared before in this conversation that one of the things you've changed as you have got older is you brought in resistance training into your life, which has made a big difference. So maybe just talk to us about this sort of area and why it's so important for aging.
Well, I think the protein conversation is super important. I think it's polarized and it's ideological, unfortunately, but it should be scientific. People think being a vegan is the way to go for longevity. Others think that you should be eating more protein. And I think there's a lot of confusion out there. And part of it has to do with beliefs and ideology. And I'm not going to get into all that. I do think that you can be a healthy vegan, but it is a lot of work and you need to know what you're doing and you need to supplement with certain things that can protect you from the challenges of being a vegan, which is getting adequate levels of certain amino acids for protein synthesis and muscle building, certain nutrients that are deficient. It's not easy, but it's doable. So I'm not saying I'm opposed to it. I'm just saying it's a harder road to hoe in terms of longevity and well-being. So when you look at protein, the feeling is that in the longevity community that we should potentially be vegan because we don't want to overstimulate a particular pathway, one of the hallmarks of aging, which we call mTOR. Now, this is one of the 4 nutrient sensing pathways in our body that samples the environment and the food we're eating and regulates all sorts of biological processes. And this is really the meta hallmark. This is the one that's, I think, the most important, which is how food interacts with our biology to create health or disease or longevity or early death. And so mTOR is stimulated by protein, and particularly by animal protein, because it has higher levels of an amino acid called leucine. Leucine is so important for tripping the switch that builds muscle. So I'm just going to stop for a minute because I want to emphasize how important muscle is to longevity. Without muscle, your metabolism goes down, your stress hormones go up, you become more insulin resistant and pre-diabetic, you become more inflamed, and it's this whole cascade of phenomena that occur because your muscle gets replaced with fat. So the key is to build and keep and increase muscle if you can as you get older to enhance longevity. And that you have to do that by tripping the switch of mTOR to build muscle. The problem is if you do that all the time, if mTOR is always stimulated, you actually don't give your body a chance to engage in one of the most important processes that are important for longevity, which is what we call autophagy. Autophagy means self-cleaning or self-cannibalism or self-eating, literally like Pac-Man. And this is a good thing because our body has the ability to go and recycle old parts, to get rid of old proteins and old cells and clean them up and actually, build new stuff, which is great. It's like recycling plastic bottles and making clothes out of it, right? So we have that internal system in our bodies that we have to turn on a regular basis in order to clean up and prevent rapid aging. So that's a good thing. And the way you activate autophagy is by inhibiting mTOR, which means don't give it food or protein, which is a good thing. So what do? Do you not eat protein to turn on autophagy, or do you eat lots of protein to build muscle? Well, the key is both. You need, like any system, you need sometimes it on and sometimes off. You need to sleep and you need to be awake. I mean, it's basically how the body works. So we need overnight to stimulate autophagy by giving ourselves a break from eating, meaning getting no food from dinner until breakfast. So no late night snacking. And you should give at least 12 hours. So if you eat dinner at 6, you can eat 6 in the morning. If you want to extend to 14, that's eating at 8 in the morning. That's doable for most people. 16 hours is a little bit longer. That can also have benefits. And that gives your body a chance to sort of pretend that it's starving, because you're not really starving, but your body thinks it's kind of maybe starving. So it starts to turn all these protective mechanisms that is related to the stress of not eating, called hormesis. And so basically, we can talk about that more. But basically, the idea is when you activate autophagy at night, it's a good thing and it's against life. However, you need to give a good protein load in the morning on a fasted state, probably 30 or 40 grams of high quality protein. When I say high quality, I mean it has to have at least 2.5 grams of leucine, which is almost impossible to get from plant protein unless you eat a huge amount, or, which people can't do, like having 6 cups of brown rice or 2 or 3 cups of beans. It's hard for people to eat that much of that stuff. And then you can add the leucine to a plant protein, but you actually have to get the leucine to turn on this. So you can have plant protein powders that are supplemented with amino acids, or you can just have a whey protein shake, or some animal protein, eggs or chicken or fish or whatever you want to eat, and that will turn on mTOR and build muscle. And then if you fast and then load up with protein in the morning and do the resistance training, maybe before you do your protein load, that's the best strategy. And that's how I built muscle, which I basically would be in this fasted state. I would work out and do my half-hour band routine. And then I would have a good protein shake with 40 grams of protein and a bunch of other goodies in it to help me build muscle. And it really works. And it works even despite the fact that as you get older, you get something called anabolic resistance, meaning your body is more resistant to building muscle. So you have to work harder and take more protein. So as we get older, we need more protein, and we need more high quality protein. And I think that's really the clear evidence from the scientific literature about what we need to do. But people get into ideological battles about, whether you should or shouldn't eat meat. I think it's really beside the point. The point is, how does our biology work? How do we work with it? How do we activate these pathways in the right way? And how do we give them a rest when we need to give them a rest?
The root cause of our patients' problems, but actually the root cause of many of society's problems, from what you're saying,
it's also food.
Is food.
Yeah, let's go into it. So we've got the chronic disease epidemic. We've got the economic burden. Let's talk about some of the social justice issues around this.
Yeah. Well, I think what will tie in really nicely there is something you said, which is, I realize that for many of my patients, it's not their fault. Now, I think that was really poignant, because when people talk about healthy food choices, a lot of people on social media, a lot of people in the media will still think it is the person's fault. They know what they should be doing. They're simply not following the advice. They need more willpower. They need to get a grip of their life. It's not good enough. But I guess what you're saying is it's not their fault.
No.
Why do so many people think it is their fault? And why do you think it's not their fault?
Oh, well, that's a great question. So the reason people think it's their fault is because we've been told by doctors, nutritionists, our governments, and of course the food industry, that all calories are the same. That calories in, calories out, exercise more, eat less, you'll lose weight. And if you don't do it, it's your fault. That all calories are the same, it's just about moderation. And that, 20-ounce soda with 250 calories is exactly the same as 8.5 cups of broccoli with 250 calories. That, I mean, even a 5-year-old can get that's ridiculous, but that's exactly the message out there. And when all calories are the same, then, there's a sense of, well, just, control yourself, right? Control yourself. It's your fault. But the truth is, we know from the science that not all calories are the same. And ultra-processed food calories affect the body, the brain, and metabolism very differently.
So what are ultra-processed foods for people who are listening to this?
It's pretty much everything in the supermarket in the middle aisles. It's packaged food. It's refined foods. It's white flour. It's white sugar. It's high fructose corn. It's trans fats. All the food additives and chemicals that are in food when you buy a packaged or processed food. It's basically what's made by the food industry.
It's the opposite of whole foods, right?
Yes. I mean, I make it really simple. When I teach in churches, I say, it's really simple to know what to eat. Leave the food that man made. Eat the food that God made. Did God make a Twinkie? No. Did God make an avocado? Yeah. Does it have an ingredient list? Probably not good to eat. Now, Of course, there are some foods that are simple ingredientless. So sardines, olive oil and salt, or tomatoes, water and salt, or there's stuff that you can buy that's canned or packaged that is real food. But most of them are not. And what's true, and this is validated with over 300 interviews with food industry insiders, whistleblowers, food scientists. It was done by Michael Moss. These foods are designed to be biologically addictive. They have craving and experts that work in taste institutes to create the bliss point of food, the quote, bliss point of food, designed to create what they call heavy users. These are their internal terms that they use within the food industry. They know actually how to create that perfect mouthfeel, that perfect brain hook where your brain is literally addicted. So it's like if I said to a patient, listen, I want you to hold your breath underwater for 10 minutes. I'm going to give you $5 million. Darn right, they're going to want to do that, but they won't be able to do that. Right? And it's the same thing when we're eating these foods. They alter our brain chemistry and our hormones in a way that affects our ability to control our behavior. And if you shut that off, it changes everything. So I'll just tell you a quick story about this woman, Janice, who came to our center, the Center for Functional Medicine at Cleveland, and joined one of our groups. And she was 66. She had type 2 diabetes. She'd been on insulin for 10 years. She had a body mass index of 43, which is very overweight. 25 or less is normal. 30 is obese. She was 43. She had high blood pressure, heart failure, kidneys were starting to fail, her liver was starting to fail, and she was on a boatload of medications, blood thinners, blood pressure medications, cholesterol meds, diuretics, you name it, she was on it. And her whole life, I mean, she was a very educated woman, but her whole life she had never learned about food. She grew up in a home that all they ate was packaged and processed food. She grew up in a home where they didn't cook. And she was just focused on her career and her life and was doing really great things, but was really on her way out. And we just literally put her on a whole foods, anti-inflammatory, detoxifying diet, basically similar to the 10-day detox diet, the book that I wrote, which is very low in starch and sugar. Within 3 days, she was off her insulin. In 3 months, she was off all her medications. Her blood sugar was normal. Her A1C went from 11 to 5.5, which as a doctor, is extremely dramatic. And
I mean, that just to put in context for people listening, that's from being a very, very poorly controlled type 2 diabetic to not actually going into the pre-diabetic range, actually into the normal range.
Yeah. And then her heart failure, which by the way, heart failure never reverses in conventional medicine. You can manage it with medications. Her ejection fraction was 35%. If it's under 30, you're headed towards a heart transplant. And it went up to 50 after her 3 months. And her kidney failure, she was on her way to dialysis, reversed, just using the power of food and putting her in a group setting where she was given support and education and knowledge.
Wow. I mean, that is so inspiring for people.
And she lost over the course of a year 116 pounds and now has her life back and is off all medication and saved about $20,000 in copays for her medication. And I don't know what her insurance company was paying.
Yeah. I mean, Mark, you have got countless stories like that because you have been talking about using food as medicine for years now. I remember before I even got into this way of thinking, I was reading blogs that you'd been writing and thinking, wow, this is incredible. I wonder if that will work if I try that.
Yeah.
And but you can see how impassioned you are talking about this. But, you mentioned the addictive qualities of foods. And I think it reminds me of a conversation I had recently on the podcast with Professor Felice Jacka. You may not know her, but you'll be familiar with her work. She was in charge of the first randomized controlled trial, the SMILES trial that was done in Australia to look at whether diet can improve depression.
Mood and depression.
Yeah, and she
study,
showed the first, 67 patients. So she showed that the group who changed their diet to a modified Mediterranean diet after 12 weeks had above a 30% remission rate compared to only 8% in the control group, which was social support.
Yeah.
And when I spoke to her on my podcast, I also mentioned to her that my cousin, who's in his late 20s, he's now working, he drives to work every day in his car. And he says when he's driving home after a busy day's work, there is one roundabout in particular where there is a KFC.
Yes.
And he says, I can smell the food every time I go through that roundabout, and I can't always resist. I will often succumb to that smell.
He should put his windows up and the recirculation button on his car so he doesn't get that
but what's
smell.
interesting is that you mentioned the taste of these foods is formulated in such a way that they almost have that sort of addictive quality to them.
Not almost, actually measurable on brain scans, looking at the part of the brain that's affected, just like heroin or cocaine. It's not an emotional addiction. It's a biological addiction.
Wow. Do you know much about the smell of these foods, whether it can do similar things?
I bet it can. I mean, I've been succumbing at sometimes. Like once at a very stressful trip, and I was coming back from somewhere, and my flame was delayed, and I was going to get it 2 a.m, and I'd see patients the next day, and I felt sorry for myself. And there was a Cinnabon stand, and they blow I think they have a fan where they blow the smell towards you, and I just went and had a Cinnabon. But yeah, it was terrible. I felt horrible after.
Yeah, but you're just showing that we're all human. We can know as much as we want about the right food choices.
Yeah.
You clearly know about the right food choices, but even you are susceptible when life gets tough, when you're stressed, when you're tired. If the food environment around you is blowing out that smell, is tempting you with their offerings, ultimately, it's going to be very hard to make those good choices.
And that's why we have to change the food system. And that's why this book, Food Fix, is, for me, such an important part of how I think about the world now. And I think about, yes, it's about obesity and diabetes and chronic disease, but also it's about mental health, as you said. And even in our kids, we see our kids not functioning well. 1 in 10 kids have attention deficit. 40% of our kids in America are overweight in school. We have increasing amounts of performance issues. We have what we call an achievement gap. We're 31st in the world in education, math, and reading and so forth. We're worse than Vietnam. And the reason is because it's affecting our kids' brains and their cognitive function. This is well documented. These kids are nutritionally deficient, and the kids who grew up in poor environments or don't have adequate high quality nutrition, their brains are 10% smaller. Their IQ points 7 points lower. We've literally lost millions of IQ points in our children.
You mentioned kids who are growing up in poor environments, so these deprived communities, and we know full well what the research says about people living in areas of lower socioeconomic status. Is the way the food industry is set up, does it unfairly penalize those with the least in society?
So when we look at the social injustice around food, it's massive. When you look at how the food industry targets poor and minorities, it's disproportionate. So they're targeting them with more ads and more marketing, and they're providing their communities with more of these foods, such as soda and processed food. And it has a big impact on them. African Americans are 80% more likely to get diabetes. They're 4 times more likely to get kidney failure. They're 3.5 times more likely to get amputations. And these communities are being targeted by the food industry in direct ways. And then there's accessibility. They live in poor environments where there's no grocery stores, where there's convenience stores and no produce stores.
Yeah. So for 7 years, Mark, I worked in a place called Oldham in North Manchester in the UK, and it was right at the centre of Oldham, and the practice was in quite a deprived area. What most people would consider a deprived area. Most of my patients were certainly on very low incomes. Many were working 2 jobs. But what was interesting is these guys really cared about themselves and their families. They were trying to make the best decisions. And I think it's really important to highlight this, because I think a lot of blame gets put on people who are struggling with their health and are making certain food choices. But I saw firsthand how, for example, I would usually bring my lunch into work with me. On the rare occasion where I forgot to bring it, sometimes I think, okay, I'm just going to go and walk and buy something. It certainly is not like Santa Monica, where we're recording this podcast, which is probably the wellness capital in the world, where it's super easy to buy something healthy, right? I would walk for about a mile in diameter around that practice, and I struggled to find anything, because there was at least 7 or 8 fried chicken and kebab shops with big signs on there saying something like, £1.99, eat as much as you can. That's what, £2, that's what, maybe about $3. It's very hard to compete with that. And I thought I can give them the best advice that I possibly can, but they're moving into an environment where it's simply too difficult day in, day out to make those healthy choices. Yeah. In addition, they I found were very trusting off the government and the supermarkets.
Yeah.
So when I explained to them about certain breakfast cereals that they were having in the morning,
It was all sugar.
yeah, they were shocked.
Yeah.
And they said, well, Dr. Chatterjee, but why are they being sold in the supermarkets? There's a picture of, a heart. It says heart's healthy on it.
Because there's no fat.
No, but what's interesting for me, Mark, is that these guys were trying their best.
Yeah.
They literally were shocked when I was telling this information. So when we think that everyone knows this stuff now, they don't. And it is these deprived areas which are getting hit the hardest.
Absolutely. I remember when I was helping with this movie Fed Up, which was released a few years ago, about the effect of the food industry and sugar on the health of our nation. There was a family that I worked with, and they lived in one of the worst food deserts in America. They were very overweight. The father was 42, already had kidney failure, on dialysis from diabetes at 42. The mother was severely overweight. The son was severely overweight at 16, had almost diabetes, and struggled. And they lived in a trailer on food stamps and disability. They were, trying to lose weight because the father couldn't get a new kidney until he lost 40 pounds, but they didn't know what to do. And they were eating all this stuff that they thought was healthy, like Cool Whip, because it had 0 trans fats, which is basically all trans fats and sugar. It just basically threw a loophole in the government that allowed them to actually say 0 trans fat. They had processed salad dressings. They used iceberg lettuce. They never knew how to cook. They didn't have any utensils. They didn't have knives, cutting knives. They didn't have cutting boards. So I said, well, rather than me giving you a lecture on, how to eat healthy, let's just go into your kitchen. Let's get some groceries and make simple food. We made turkey chili. We made a salad from like real lettuce and real vegetables and olive oil and vinegar dressing. We roasted some sweet potatoes with some herbs. We stir-fried some asparagus. They didn't know how to do any of that. They didn't know how to roast. They didn't know how to saute. They didn't know how to nothing. And what vegetables they had were canned green beans and iceberg lettuce, and that was pretty much it. And everything else was from a box or a package. And they really didn't know. And I said, here's what's going on. And I took everything out of their cupboard. I showed them everything. I covered over the front of the boxes and said, what is this? And they couldn't tell by looking at the ingredient list. And I said, it's all the same stuff, just in different size, shapes, and colors. And they were so eager. And I said, let's cook a meal together. So we sat together, we cooked, we talked, we had fun. They loved the food. It was delicious. And I said, look, you guys can do this. Here's a cookbook. Here's a guide on eat well for less, good food on a tight budget. And I didn't know what was going to happen. In the first week, she texted me back. We lost 18 pounds as a family. Within a year, the mother lost about 100 pounds. The son lost 50, gained it back by working at a fast food restaurant, which is only place to work down there. But eventually he got his act together. He lost 138 pounds. He asked me for a letter of recommendation for medical school. And now he's in medical school.
Wow.
Which is just staggering and amazing. And we have, the ability to actually do this if people understand what's going on. But most people don't understand that they're being taken advantage of, that they're being targeted. The system is set up for them to fail. And it's not an accident. I was sort of alluding to the reason we have these policies is because the food industry controls the government. They spend $500 million just on our farm bill in the U.S., which controls our food and ag policy. There's 100% of the Senate and House Ag Committee members are on the take from big food and big ag in terms of campaign donations. Who do you think they're going to support? Corporate interests or citizens? And it's really unfortunate. The policies that we have are so destructive. I'll just go through them. One, we support the growing of commodity foods, corn, soy, and wheat, which gets turned into processed food. So we make it cheap to have processed food and high fructose corn syrup. I mean, the vice chairman of Pepsi said, when I asked him, why do you use high fructose corn syrup? He said, because the government makes it too cheap for us not to use it. And I said, we have policies that allow unlimited marketing of junk food to our children and the rest of us, where it's proven to cause harm. The FDA makes food labels, the Federal Food and Drug Administration, that are so confusing that the average person can't understand them, and doesn't prohibit the use of toxic chemicals that are used in our food supply, which are mostly banned in Europe. Things like BHT and other things. We have policies that support food stamps. In other words, not only are we helping grow the food that's the bad food, but then we provide it to our poor with $75 billion a year in food stamps, $7 billion of which is soda, and Coca-Cola's major source of American revenue, 20% of it, comes from food stamps.
That is
so they're the biggest welfare queen.
Could you, for a lot of my UK listeners, could you explain what food stamps are?
Yeah, food stamps basically food assistance. If you're poor, and there are 46 million Americans who need food support because they're basically, it's like a credit card that you can go buy food with. And they can't afford to buy food, so the government gives them money to do it. But it's all processed food, and 1 in 4 children in this country depend on food stamps.
So it seems maddening, this, because on one hand, you've got potentially the government doing a good thing, which is, okay, you can't afford food, we're going to help you.
Yeah.
But with the other hand, they're supporting, if I understand this right, they're supporting
completely
the wrong food choices,
really?
Or the unhelpful food choices. So they could keep the food stamp system, but encourage whole foods instead of processed foods. And then suddenly you're helping these communities out and supporting their health.
Absolutely. And it's been shown you could save billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of deaths by incentivizing good food and de-incentivizing bad food. But they won't happen because the government is so locked up with the food industry.
Mark, I want to ask you a question. In all the years I've known you and seen you speak, you've always been very passionate about getting to the root cause of problems. You've always been extremely passionate about how powerful food is.
Yeah.
But I don't think I've ever seen you this impassioned about a particular topic.
No.
And it's really...
And I'm just getting started.
Yeah, but it's really interesting for me is that you've dived deep into the research on this over the last few years. I know that when writing this book, you sort of locked yourself away. You've actually really tried to understand systemically what is going on here. Has what you have found, is that what's driving this new sort of supercharged passion? Has that made you angry?
It has made me angry because, it made me angry. It's also made me optimistic because if we can identify and name the problem, we can do something about it. We talk about climate change. People go, I get climate change. But nobody's talking about the impact of the food system, not just on chronic disease and the economy and our kids' brains and mental health, even violence, we know is linked to bad food in prisons. Violent prisoners can reduce violent crime in prisons by 56% just by eating a healthy diet. But we also know that it's destroying our environment and our climate, that the food system is the #1 cause of climate change. People don't get that. People don't understand that when you put it all together, whether it's deforestation, soil erosion, factory farming, whether it's food waste, processing, distribution, refrigeration of food, all that together makes the food system the #1 cause of climate change. It's not driving an electric car. We've got to fix the food system.
Well, let's get into climate change because it's clearly a topic that is at the tip of many people's tongues these days. It's a very hot political agenda. There have been many documentaries made on what is driving climate change, but it's also a bit like the diet wars in terms of what foods we should be eating. The climate change wars, potentially it can be quite polarizing in terms of what foods are driving this.
Yes.
And I know, I don't know how much you've gone into that. What are those foods that are driving it? And I wonder whether we could broaden out that discussion in terms of soil health, regenerative agriculture, climate change. What are the foods that are driving this and how do we change it?
Great question. So, I think we've pretty much gotten into this conversation that meat is the cause of climate change, that we should not eat meat and all be vegans and that would solve climate change.
Would it?
Depends. And it's a more nuanced answer. So factory farming of animals absolutely is a significant contributor to climate change, whether it's 10%, 14%, it's a significant contributor. Why? Because factory farm animals, it's not just about the methane burps from the cows. It's about the way we grow the food that feeds the cows. So we grow a lot of corn through industrial processes that destroy the soil, which use up enormous water resources, that depends on huge amounts of fossil fuel dependent things like fertilizer, which takes a lot of energy to make, herbicides and pesticides, which are fossil fuel derived. And so we have a real problem. And then all the factory farming of animals also drives huge amounts of methane into the environment. So you've got this whole problem of factory farming of animals. But as a friend of mine said, it's not the cow, it's the how. So when you look at one of the biggest drivers of climate change, it's the loss of soil. We think of the rainforest, but the soil on the earth is a far bigger carbon sink than all the rainforests.
Well, let's dive into that, because I think a lot of people listening to this will not be familiar with this. What does the soil do? Why is soil health so important for the environment, but also for human health?
So we have lost huge amounts of soil. So we lose about 2 billion tons of soil every year, 200,000 tons an hour. We lose farmland the size of North Korea or Nicaragua to desert every year. Soil, if it's healthy, not the soil that we now have in America, because we've lost so much soil. We've lost a third of all the soil on the planet for farming because of the way we grow food. We basically till it, and then we pour these chemicals into it that destroy the organic matter of the soil. Now, organic matter is basically carbon. It's carbon in the soil. How does it get there? Through a very powerful, the most powerful technology on the planet to reduce carbon. It's called photosynthesis. It's this ancient technology.
Can't beat nature.
That sucks carbon out of the environment. What do plants and grasses breathe? They breathe carbon dioxide, and they suck it in, and then they build plant material, right? They build carbon. It goes into the soil. Every 1% of carbon in the soil, of organic matter in the soil, will help to draw down carbon, and it'll also help to restore water in the soil. 1% organic matter in the soil leads to an extra 27,000 gallons of water that can be stored in there. Why are we having droughts and floods and wildfires? Because the soil can't hold the water anymore. So it either runs through it or it just kind of runs off it, and that leads to this huge amounts of droughts and floods. So organic matter in the soil is the thing we have to build, and we've lost most of it. In fact, we had so many in America, we had places with 50 feet of topsoil that's now almost gone because it was built by the bison and the elk, 60 million bison. We had more ruminants running around America than we have cows. And there was no climate change from it. It wasn't that, because they basically grazed the grass in a certain way, moving around frequently. They dug with their hoofs, they pooped and peed, and that's what builds soil. It uses natural fertilizer, right? The cows become part of the cycle. And I think, regenerative agriculture is the science of how do we build new soil as a solution to creating a healthy ecosystem, to dealing with our scarce water resources, to increasing biodiversity, which we all depend on. We've lost 75% of our pollinator species because of all the chemical agriculture. And Einstein said that if we lose bees off the face of the earth, humans have 4 years to live.
So you say it's not the cow, it's the how. So therefore, has your research basically shown that if we go, I guess, to more traditional ways, or I don't know if we have to find newer ways?
Well, it's almost mimicking nature, right? Mimicking how natural herds moved around. These big herds moved around in concentrated groups. They would not graze the grass to the nub. They would kind of graze it down halfway. They'd move along, they'd poop and pee, and they kept doing this. And this is what built the soil. So when we look, for example, at life cycle analysis that was done by Qantas of both a GMO soy burger, was actually the Impossible Burger, compared to a regenerative farms, grass-fed, regeneratively raised beef burger, they found that while the Impossible Burger was far better than a feedlot burger in terms of its carbon footprint, it added 3.5 kilos of carbon to the environment. So it was a net add of carbon and greenhouse gases to the environment by eating an Impossible Burger or a GMO soy burger. The grass-fed burger pulled out 3.5 kilos of carbon from the atmosphere.
Okay.
So you basically have to eat one regeneratively raised grass-fed burger to offset the carbon emissions of a soy burger.
Mind-blowing. That is mind-blowing, actually. That's exactly what the words I was going to say. This
isn't my opinion. This is an independent scientific group that analyzed both of those systems.
So just to clarify that, what we're saying, or what the research you've done is saying...
I've not done the research. I just reporting.
Okay,
yeah.
So essentially what this research is saying is that an Impossible Burger is better than a feedlot burger. So a convention, these sort of factory farmed burgers. So on that, if you make an argument between those two, yes, an Impossible Burger is better.
For sure.
But if you compare an Impossible Burger to a...
regeneratively raised grass-fed burger,
then that is better for the environment than the Impossible Burger. Now, that is not the narrative that is being played out in the media at the moment. And I guess then the question is,
Well,
is that also on purpose? Is that also
Yes.
part of this big structural problem with the
Sure.
food industry?
It's huge. Yeah, it's huge. I mean, I think, yes, we should be finding, other alternatives and protein sources. That's great. But it's also a highly processed industrial food. And when we talk about growing the soy, what does that mean? Well, we're growing soy in large monocrop fields. Often these are rainforests that have been destroyed and taken down, although I don't know if they may use American sources. The amount of fertilizer destroys the soil and the organic matter in the soil. It off-gases greenhouse gases. It takes a lot of energy, fossil fuels, to produce, and it runs off into the rivers and lakes and oceans. In fact, in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a dead zone the size of New Jersey that kills 212,000 metric tons of fish every year. There are 400 dead zones like that across the world in areas of coastal areas that feed 500 million people on the planet. And if you put them all together, it would be the size of Europe. That's just the nitrogen fertilizer. And then let's talk about the herbicides and the pesticides. They also kill pollinator species and the biodiversity in the soil, and they don't promote organic matter. So they kill the organic matter in the soil. So you end up with, then the soil needs massive amounts of irrigation because it can't hold water. We have 70% of human use of fresh water is for irrigation of crops, mostly for animal production. So we have water depletion, which we're losing our water resources. We have the killing of the soil. We have the polluting of our lakes and rivers. We have the loss of biodiversity when you're eating your Impossible Burger. Now, that is a shock, right, for most people to hear, because it sounds like it's a soy burger, grass-fed and all that. Or, I mean, it's a plant-based burger. But it's not as simple as that. And when you look at the ecosystem services that are provided by a regenerative farm, it's massive. So there's been huge investments now in buying up old regular farms and converting them to grass-fed or regenerative farms because they provide so much benefit. So they provide an economic benefit as well.
So we provide. So that's important. If this is going to be part of the solution, there has to also be an economic benefit. That's the harsh reality of life.
We use about, I don't know, it's $120 trillion a year of ecosystem services from the planet. We're basically extracting these and using them. Whereas regenerative agriculture can actually provide value. It increases the biodiversity of the soil. It increases the water retention, increases the organic matter. It sucks carbon out of the environment. And it's been estimated, that the soil can hold 3 times the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere today. And if you actually were to scale this up, and it needs to be scaled up, that it could literally draw down all the carbon from the Industrial Revolution.
Are we essentially saying if we fix the soil,
the solution's under our feet?
We fix our health. We fix the food industry. We fix climate change.
Yes, because not only are you growing different kinds of food, the food you're growing is so much more nutrient dense. Why do plants get nutrients? They get it from the soil. If you don't have the right microbes in the soil, you can't extract the minerals and vitamins from the soil. We know that our plants, even if they're healthy organic plants, have 50% less nutrient levels than they did 50 years ago.
Yeah, and that's I think really important for many of us to remember. And I've seen plenty of data supporting this, that the broccoli from 2019 is not the same broccoli as the one in 1970 in terms of the nutrients available. Wow. So we could be trying our best and trying to eat as many vegetables as we can, trying our best, if we can afford it, to go for these organic vegetables, but we still are not getting the nutrients that pretty much everyone was getting 40, 50 years ago.
And the problem is, that there are basically a couple of dozen companies that control the food system. The big food companies, the big ag and processing companies, the agrochemical companies, the seed companies, the fertilizer companies. There's just a few companies that have massively consolidated. There used to be over 100 seed companies 30 years ago. Now there's like 4, big ones that control 60% of our food.
Well, you mentioned all these pesticides and herbicides that are getting used and the damage that's causing to the soil. But I was reading bits of your book where I think you were suggesting that being a farmer in the United States is quite a dangerous job.
Yes.
So as well as the systemic implications of this, what are the implications for that individual farmer?
Well, this is another part of the social injustice issue. There's many aspects of that, but food and farm workers were excluded from Fair Labor Act that was developed in the 30s to create fair labor standards in the United States, minimum wage, working conditions, and so forth. Why? Because most of the food and farm workers were former slaves. So they weren't protected. And that has carried over even now, 80 or 90 years later, we're seeing lack of protection. So the average, food worker may make $2 an hour and depend on tips. They make, minimum wage or less, and they're unable to take care of their own health care. They're unable to provide their food services. Many of these workers have to be on food stamps or food assistance. And the farming itself is highly dangerous. They are the pesticides, the chemicals they use, the working conditions.
I mean, you see pictures,
It's
I think,
horrible.
of strawberry farmers
Wearing
with
gas
face
masks,
masks on. Gas masks, the whole thing
yeah.
is covered whilst they're spraying pesticides.
And the food workers, it's, working in a big chicken factory, for example, processing chickens, it's like a one step after the other, repetitive motion injuries. They even don't let them go to the bathroom, and they come to work in diapers. So next time you're having your factory farm chicken, think of that food worker who can't even go to the bathroom and has to pee in a diaper because she can't leave the food line. Think about that.
If I were to prescribe one intervention to extend life, to prevent and reverse chronic disease, it would be to drastically reduce or eliminate sugar and refined starch from your diet.
Yeah.
Why is that so important?
The idea that sugar and starch are driving the dysfunctions that we see as normal aging, but are really abnormal aging, is not really new. We know that underlying all the chronic diseases of aging, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obviously, dementia, these are all related to disturbances in our ability to regulate our blood sugar, to what we call insulin resistance, where our body becomes resistant to the effects of insulin. And this creates this whole downstream cascade that is like a wildfire on the aging process. It causes you to gain belly fat. It drives up inflammation. It lowers your hormones. It increases cortisol, increases your stress hormones. It actually also causes abnormal cholesterol, fatty liver, all sorts of problems. Shrinks your hippocampus in your brain, fuels cancer cells. I mean, it is the nightmare if you want to be someone who's healthy and healthy for a long time. I mean, the idea basically is to have your lifespan, which is how long you're alive, be equal to your health span, which is how many years of your life you're healthy. And for most people, they're about 20 years short on the health span and their lifespan.
Yeah, it is incredible. You have been talking about this for years, yet the consumption of these foods, the consumption of ultra-processed foods all over the globe appear to be on the rise.
Totally.
So can you talk to us a little bit about ultra-processed foods? What are they exactly, and why are they so problematic for our health?
Well, historically, we've evolved eating foods in their original states in the complex matrix of fiber, vitamins, minerals, protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And they're in a rich array of phytochemicals and other matrices that make our bodies be able to manage and handle these things. Ultra-processed foods are essentially food-like substances that are made from highly processed ingredients from some commodity crops, soy, wheat, and corn mostly, that are then turned into all sizes, shapes, colors of chemically extruded substances that bear no resemblance to the original form and cause all sorts of havoc in our biology, aside from all the preservatives, additives, thickeners, artificial sweeteners, things that are also problematic for health. But just the processing of the food itself in a way that pulverizes it into something that isn't resembling food at all and then reassembles it in a way that actually is harmful to our biology. It's quickly absorbed. It sends signals to our biology that we're not getting any real food. In fact, people who eat ultra-processed food, if given, compared to and this is a controlled trial where they gave people either ultra-processed food or they gave them whole food and the same amount of food they could sort of eat as much as they wanted, the people who had the ultra-processed food ate 500 calories more a day. That's basically the equivalent to gaining a pound a week or 52 pounds a year. So it's no wonder we're such an obese society, increasingly in the UK. I think the United States has you beat a little bit, but not by much. I think the reality is that this ultra-processed food is driving so much of the challenges we see in our society. For every 10% of your diet that's ultra-processed food, your risk of death goes up by 14%. And in America, 60% of our diet is ultra-processed food. In kids, it's almost 70% of their diet. This is just a deadly combination that not only causes long-term problems of, shorter lifespan, and we're seeing our life expectancy go down, but also immediate problems of all sorts of conditions that we now know are related to the starch and sugar, whether it's fatty liver in kids that need liver transplants or kids who are, having heart attacks at 20 years old because of this. I mean, it's really pretty frightening.
You said there, for every 10% increase in ultra-processed foods, your risk of death goes up by 14%.
14%. Yeah, that's from the Global Burden of Disease Study, huge study of 195 countries, 11 million people die every year from eating the wrong food. That's more than smoking or wars or anything else. It is the number one killer in the world today.
So, Mark, despite all this knowledge, why is consumption still going up? What's going on? Is it an individual problem, or is it the food industry? Right?
Yeah. Well, this is my last book, which was Food Fix, where I mapped out the problems with our food policies and our food industry, and how everything that we're doing is fostering the production, the production, the marketing, and the sale of these ultra processed foods in ways we've never seen in human history. And that's really what's driving it. And I'm working hard on my nonprofit, the Food Fix campaign, to change those food policies to address, food marketing to kids, for example. And Boris Johnson, thankfully, he got wise once he got COVID, that food was related to his poor health, and that he understood that the reason he ended up in the ICU from COVID was because he was in poor metabolic health. And that was because of the starch and sugar and processed foods. And he then started to restrict marketing and other kinds of initiatives that actually were trying to lower the consumption of sugar and ultra processed food, which I think is great. But that needs to happen, globally. And in America, the effect of this is not just on aging, but is on everything. If you look at America, it's 4% of the world's population, but it was 16% of the COVID cases and deaths, which means we have a 400% increase compared to what we should have in terms of our population. Why is that? Because COVID hit a population that was pre-inflamed, that was metabolically unhealthy, and that was at high risk for having complications and death from COVID. And that's why we're not, because we have a crappy healthcare system. We spend more than any other country by double, and yet we did the worst.
Yeah. In your experience, Mark, and you have been, you've seen tens of thousands of patients over maybe 3 decades now, a long time.
I'm scared to say that I started medical school 40 years ago this fall.
Well, one of the reasons I actually love talking to you, Mark, is because you have been a practicing clinician for so long. You have real world experience with patients. And as much as we both enjoy talking to researchers, it can be very interesting to learn about new research. But I think there is something special, certainly for me, about talking to clinicians, because the research doesn't always apply to that person in front of you. But what are some of the common traps that people fall into, would you say, when they're trying to choose their food? For example, what are some foods that maybe people think are healthy from the way that they're marketed, but actually are causing them short-term and long-term problems?
That's a great question. I think, to more directly answer your question, which I indirectly answered about whose responsibility is it? Is it a personal responsibility that we need to just all eat less and exercise more? Or is there something else going on? And there's something else going on, which is that we are highly addicted to these foods. They're designed to hijack our brain chemistry, our hormones, our metabolism, and they do a very good job at that. And so we have to realize that there is some level of personal responsibility, but there's also the food environment and the food that's available and the compounds that are in the food that hijack our biology. So that I think is important to understand, to not blame the person who's overweight. That is one of the most, I think, damaging things that we do as a medical profession, as nutritionists, in our health policy. It's certainly the mantra of food companies, which is there's no good and bad calories. It's all about moderation. And if you want to sort of have Coca-Cola or Pepsi and it's part of your caloric intake, that's okay. And that's just a bunch of nonsense. As far as the foods that we think are okay that aren't okay, well, I think maybe we sort of don't understand when we see things like whole grains, that actually a lot of the whole grain foods out there are highly processed whole grains that are, put in Cheerios or Frosted Flakes. So we have, like new Frosted Flakes with extra, whole grains in them. It just is insane. I think we need to be very careful of food marketing and food labeling. If you want to have food, try to have it in its original form. Whole grains are actually that whole grains, and you can cook them yourself at home. And that's really important to not fall for these sort of marketing claims. I think also low fat is a terrible thing that we should be avoiding. I think a lot of low fat foods are high in sugar. And that was really the damaging message of the 90s with the food pyramid in America, where we were told to eat 6 to 11 servings of bread, rice, cereal, and pasta a day and cut our fat consumption. And we did that. And subsequently became the increasingly obese around the globe because of that advice that was really shared globally. So there's some really simple things like avoid low fat foods, eat good fats, and don't fall for false marketing labels where it says it's healthy for you if it's a processed food.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Breakfast cereals are a huge culprit, I think.
Oh, God.
The majority of breakfast cereals, not all of them, but the majority are probably not helping people. They're certainly not helping them start the day. They're probably putting them on a blood sugar roller coaster right from the start of the day.
Yeah.
But can I just clarify, Mark, what you said on low fat there? Because there's obviously foods that are whole foods that are naturally low fat, and there's low fat products that the food industry have made. Are you specifically
broccoli's
talking?
Broccoli's low fat. I mean, that's fine. Asparagus are low fat. That's okay. It's all the low fat processed food I'm talking about as a marketing claim, or if it says high fiber, or if it has whole grain on it. These are ways in which the food industry uses sort of marketing on the front of package labeling to confuse people. And for example, Cheerios is a great example. Everything's Cheerios is a health food. It's oat bran, it's oat fiber, it's healthy, lower your cholesterol. It sounds good. But in fact, the glycemic index of Cheerios is worse than table sugar. So that is a problem. The glycemic index is 74 out of 100, table sugar 65. So I think we have to be very careful when we kind of eat these foods and how they impact our blood sugar. It's really important for us to understand that, how food affects our blood sugar, as we discussed at the outset of the podcast, is the most important determinant of our long-term health and well-being, including things like depression, fertility, acne, all sorts of problems that aren't just about heart attacks, strokes, cancer, dementia, and diabetes.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that sort of thorough overview and summary. These are, of course, things that you've discussed and written about many times, particularly in your last book, Food Fix, which was, a fantastic deep dive into that area. The new book, Young Forever. Now, I really like it because there's a real practicality throughout it. I just want to ask you, though, why this topic, right? Why the topic of aging? And perhaps you could also share where you are in your life. If you're happy to share your age, why is this so important for you?
Well, I always joke, everybody's favorite radio station is WIFM. What's in it for me? And I'm 63, so I'm interested in what's in it for me, because I don't want to age poorly. I want to be vibrant and do all the things I love to do, whether it's go skiing or gallop down the beach on a horse or go for a long bike ride or do whatever I want to do. I don't want to be limited, and I want to be able to enjoy life fully and travel and do all the things that really give me joy and make life meaningful. And to be able to show up and do the work I want to do in the world, and to be engaged and focused and healthy, to be able to actually show up for the people that matter and my relationships, to be in contribution. And so in order to do that, I have to be healthy. And so I'm very interested in the topic of how you stay healthy as we get older. But I also find, and by the way, biologically, according to new metrics that we can use to measure a biological age, I'm only 43. So I'm still pretty young. And the truth is, I wanted to focus on this topic of longevity science because, unlike other disciplines in medicine, this is a relatively new field of research. And because in the past, we thought there was nothing we can do about aging, that we actually just need to actually stop worrying about it and deal with the disease of aging, instead of actually having the things that we we can actually do something about. And from a functional medicine perspective, I found the longevity science kind of being almost a representation of the truth that we've known a long time in functional medicine, that their body is a system, that there are underlying root causes of disease, that if we want to really deal with all these diseases that we see, the 155,000 diseases that are in our international classification system, that we need to sort of go back to understand root causes. And in longevity science, there are 10 hallmarks of aging that have been discussed that are underlying all the disease of aging. So heart disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia, the aging process, cell frailty, all those things we now understand are not normal processes. They're abnormal processes that are resulting from disturbances in these fundamental systems or functions. And when they go wrong, we call these the hallmarks of aging. But we can intervene with these things. And they're very much in the functional medicine kind of framework of the body as a system of dealing with root causes. And so I thought by focusing on longevity science, I could help to elucidate what I thought were the flaws in it, which is that it didn't go far enough to look at the causes of the hallmarks. So the hallmarks of aging are the causes of all the diseases in aging. What causes the hallmarks in the first place? And that's where functional medicine comes in, to be able to be a detective and find out where the imbalances are and how we can correct them so we can positively influence these hallmarks of aging.
Yeah, Mark, since we last spoke, there's a lot of new listeners to this podcast, and some people may not be familiar with the functional medicine approach. So you sort of outlined some key tenets there, which are really interesting. But I wonder if you could just give an overview for people who think medicine is medicine.
Yeah.
Maybe for someone who's never heard about the difference before, how do you sort of briefly summarize the key differences between conventional Western allopathic medicine and the functional medicine approach?
Well, functional medicine is really what will be medicine. It's a whole view of biology that's shifting from a reductionist disease-based model to a systems model of understanding the body as an interconnected network of biological systems that we have to treat as a whole. And functional medicine from the perspective of the patient is about not treating all the individual symptoms and diseases separately, but really treating your whole system. And I'll just give you an example that illustrates the clear difference. This is a patient that I talk about in the book, young forever. She was about a 50-year-old woman, business executive coach, who had all sorts of problems. Psoriatic arthritis, which is a terrible condition of the skin and joints. It's quite kind of debilitating. And she was on a drug that cost $50,000 a year for this, an immune suppressant. She also had terrible irritable bowel syndrome and bloating. She had been on lots of antibiotics and steroids. She also had reflux. She had depression. She had insomnia. She had migraines. She also had prediabetes, was overweight. And so rather than, treating all her diseases separately, which were being done, right? She saw the psychiatrist for her depression, the endocrinologist for her prediabetes, the neurologist for her migraines, the gastroenterologist for her GI symptoms, the rheumatologist for her psoriatic arthritis. And she was given the best possible treatment by all these physicians. They were excellent physicians doing exactly what we were taught in medical school and what is exactly the current state of treatment for each of these diseases. However, she was not better. She was marginally improved and her symptoms were mostly or partly managed, but she wasn't better. And so rather than saying, well, I'm just going to kind of up your dose of these drugs or that drugs, I'm going to get to the root cause. And all the diseases that she had were all inflammatory diseases. Her diabetes, her prediabetes, her weight issues, her migraines, her depression, her psoriatic arthritis, obviously, her gut issues. These are all inflammatory. So from a functional medicine perspective, we go, what's causing the inflammation? And I joke and I say I'm an inflammologist, which is actually what we need to be if we're studying longevity, because the whole process of aging is called inflammaging. And so rather than treat all these things separately, I said, well, her gut is where 70% of her immune system lives. She's having terrible gut symptoms. I guarantee you she's got a leaky gut. She's got probably bacterial overgrowth, yeast overgrowth, and a leaky gut, and lots of food sensitivities and reactions. So what I did was simply put her on an elimination diet. I got rid of all the sugar, processed food, gluten, dairy, obviously alcohol, and get her on a whole foods diet with good proteins, lots of good fats, lots of fruits and vegetables. And I said to her, take a fish oil, a vitamin D, probiotic, super simple regimen of supplements that I thought she needed based on her history. I said, don't stop your medication, but just continue to do this and we'll check back in and go over everything in about 6 weeks. So she came back 6 weeks later. She'd stopped all her medication, including the $50,000 drug for her psoriatic arthritis. And I didn't tell her to do it, but she stopped everything. Yeah. Her symptoms were completely gone from everything. Her skin was cleared up. Her joints were cleared up. Her migraines were gone. Her depression was gone. Her insomnia was gone. She lost 20 pounds. Her irritable bowel, her reflux was gone. I also gave her stuff to reset her gut, and it non-absorbed antibiotic and an antifungal that got rid of all the bad guys in her gut that were causing all this inflammation. So this is a case that I really focused on the root cause, which was her gut, to treat all these other problems. And when we got her gut healthy, everything else went away. So when you create health, when you create a healthy system, take out the bad stuff, put in the good stuff, the body has a chance to repair and renew. And that's what's really the exciting part, Rangan, about the longevity research, is that now we understand that the body has this extraordinary ability to renew, repair, rejuvenate, and reverse our biological age. Just as our skin has the ability to heal when we cut it, our body has that innate healing system. We've just done everything possible to interfere with it, to impede it. And the book, Young Forever, is really a roadmap. And how do you actually activate these ancient embedded healing systems in our body that can reverse our biological age and make us younger as we get older?
I saw this on Twitter recently, actually. Someone, I can't remember who it was, who wasn't a huge believer in organic food, actually tweeted something. I wish I could remember who it was, and said, actually, you know what? I was wrong, because I didn't realize the implications it had on those individual farmers.
Oh, yeah.
And I was just thinking about my own health. And that's a separate story, which if we had time, we can go into. But he said, actually, I realized how selfish I was being, because actually the implications for that individual farmer is huge. And I think...
And they're kids, the data has been looked at, but the pesticide exposure in these groups has led to a loss of 41 million IQ points in these kids. We're literally sacrificing the minds of our future generation. We're destroying the intellectual capital of our society.
I think that this appears to be, I think it's a global problem, but from what I see, and I'm interested as to where the bulk of your research has been on this, is this more of a problem in the United States than anywhere else in the world?
Well, like the United States, it leads in many things, but it's not just the United States. It's everywhere. It's global. 80% of the world's type 2 diabetics in the developing world. China and India are number 1 and 2 in diabetes. We're seeing, Africa being inundated with the fast food companies taking over. It's aspirational. It's a sign of affluence to eat at KFC in Ghana. And they are controlling the narrative and manipulating the science all around the world. In Malaysia, they're partnering with, quote, nutrition scientists to produce research that shows that the products are healthy. And
it's interesting. I just had a thought as you were talking about that these so-called developing countries, which I guess is in many ways a misnomer now, and because very soon I think China and India are probably going to be more developed than we are here.
Yeah.
But I remember as a kid, when I used to go to Calcutta in India every other summer, we'd go for 6 weeks because my family, all my aunts and uncles.
Wow, that's a rough place.
Yeah, so, well, it's a beautiful place actually, and we, but yes, there's a lot of poverty, a lot of problems there. But I remember as a kid going there, and in the summer, in our British summer, in July and August, the schools were still running. So I'd go and see my cousins, but they'd be going to school. And I remember in the morning, breakfast would be served, and they had proper meals.
Yeah.
So, meal would be prepared. So there'd be like 2 or 3 vegetable curries, maybe a bit of fish, maybe some chapati breads, maybe a bit of rice. But they had a proper meal before they went to school.
Yeah.
And I used to think, this is so different because, I have a quick bowl of cereal that takes 2 minutes to prepare. If that, probably takes 30 seconds to pour the milk over and eat that. And I didn't really realize the significance of it at the time. But now as I reflect, and now when I go back, I've not been for a few years, but culture has changed. What you said about the middle classes aspiring to this Western way of living. Now they're too busy. Now they don't want a proper meal. No. They want the quick cereal. And you see the big adverts everywhere that, the food companies have come in, they're advertising how healthy these foods are. They want the quick, highly processed bread that you can put in the toaster for 20 seconds. It's toasted and you can slap on some jam and then get out to work quickly. Yeah. And it's amazing that actually, this was only like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, where they were having the middle classes in India were having these proper meals before they went out for the day, whereas now they've aspired for this, what they consider this Western ideal. And it's quite striking how quickly that's changed.
It's true. And, you know, the good news, though, you know, in researching the book is there's a lot of bad news. But the good news is that there is a lot that can be done to fix this problem. That's why I call the book Food Fix, because there are solutions that citizens can do in terms of choosing what they eat, in terms of composting. For example, food waste is a huge issue. This third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, if it were a country after US and China. We have ways we can influence our choices with our wallets and our votes. So people often are cynical about the political process and voting, but it matters, and we do have control. There are grassroots movements and efforts happening all around. And I think there are a lot of things that people can do to get involved and to actually change their personal life, their personal health, and their communities. And that's really what Food Fix is about. It's about outlining what those solutions are and how to do them.
So you sound, as well as sounding impassioned and almost, you know, I wouldn't say angry. Angry is the wrong word, but certainly
a little
frustrated.
Angry. A little frustrated. A little like,
there's a real
wake up, everybody! This is happening.
There's a real notes of optimism here, and I think let's go into that optimism, because I think if people are listening to this and they're affected by this and they think, yeah, well, actually, okay, fine, I can't maybe influence the political system, although maybe there is a way that they can.
Absolutely, you can.
But on an individual level, let's talk about some of the things they can do. And I tell you, on a personal level, as I've been reading more about factory farming, as I've understood it more, yeah, sure, the financial case, the political case, but just the moral and ethical case around it in terms of how animals are treated.
Absolutely.
There's a Thai restaurant near to where we live where, you know, sometimes my wife and my kids will go out and eat there. We like the food there. And I, in the past, maybe a few years ago, would have had, let's say, pad Thai chicken noodles. Okay. But recently, for the last couple of years, I will now no longer have that, because I know that the chicken being served there, I don't think is of high quality. I don't think, I think it's factory farmed. They're very unclear on where this chicken comes from. And so, you know, you could say we should boycott the restaurant. Okay, you can make that case, but we don't. We go, but I will have I'll have the vegetarian pad Thai noodles now. So I won't support and pay for something on the menu as much as I possibly can that actually is going to support that industry. And I feel I'm doing a little bit. You know, I had this conversation a few weeks ago with my kids. They wanted the chicken. And I said, look, guys, you know, do you know where that chicken comes from? Do you know what is happening? Do you still want that chicken? And look, I'm not saying I'm doing this the right way with my kids, but I think kids are the future. And I think if we can teach and have these conversations with our kids, then they're going to see this from a young age. And they were like, yeah, actually, Daddy, we'll have the vegetarian one as well. Yeah. How much of a difference does a simple choice for a family of four like that actually make?
It can make a difference. I mean, imagine if everybody in the world decided for one day they were going to not eat any processed food or any fast food. Don't you think that would have a big impact on the global markets? I think we have more influence than we believe, and I think it all starts with grassroots efforts and movements. So if people start demanding things, it changes. I mean, I got a text today because I did a podcast with Tom Newmark about the carbon underground, which is essentially about carbon underground, meaning getting the soil full of carbon again. And I talked about regenerative agriculture and how important it is. I talked about the fact that General Mills was sort of guilted and forced into committing 1 million acres to be converted to regenerative ag. And the person who texted me works at Nestle. And she says, I'm going to bring this to the CEO of Nestle. Would you be willing to meet with the CEO of Nestle to talk about these issues and get them to start changing their supply chain? Because if these companies start, it can make a big difference. And not everybody has that ability to make those levers that I maybe can, but it's possible. There's a guy named Jeremy Kohler who was a business guy from the UK who aggregated $12 trillion in assets from institutional investors and pension funds and said, look, guys, we're going to try to end factory farming of animals. First, we're going to start with antibiotics. We're going to go to the top 20 fast food companies who we are all invested in, and we're going to tell them we're going to divest if you don't stop antibiotics by this date from all your food, like McDonald's and Burger King and all that stuff. And they did, and it worked. So there are levers that can be pulled in the system, whether it's through business, whether it's through the market from the bottom up. You know, the groundswell is pushing companies to do the right thing, into sustainability, into thinking about their communities. And they want, I mean, I think there is more consciousness now happening in those companies because they're hearing it from, you know, the consumers who want this. And so the consumer demand is driving the marketplace.
Yeah. So the more we all can make these choices, the more people listening to this can go, okay, you know what? I'm going to see what small difference I can make in my life. That's going to have a significant knock-on effect. You know, there's...
I mean, we're all like, see the growth in electric cars. I mean, that is going to replace the combustion engine very soon. Why? Because consumers and people are demanding it.
Yeah.
Same thing can happen with food. You
mentioned prisons before.
Yeah.
And I found that really interesting. Both you and I have spoken to Dan Buettner on our podcasts, the chap who has studied extensively these so-called blue zones around the world, these areas of high longevity, these longevity hotspots. And what's striking about that is that a lot of people are, debating what are the various components of that. But one thing that seems to be really consistent is that the environment is set up in such a way that it makes the healthy choice the easy choice.
Yeah.
Right? And you mentioned a statistic, something like if you serve healthy food in a prison, it was 50-something%.
Well,
it was,
they basically were looking at, you talked about the SMILE study about the effect of food on depression, and we know mental illness is really driven by a lot of nutritional deficiencies. In violence and behavior change, we don't really think about it that way. But in prisons, they've done randomized trials where they put half the group on a healthy diet, half the group on the same prison diet, who were violent criminals, violent in prison. And they reduced violent crime by 56%. And if they added a multivitamin, they reduced it by 80%. And I remember once coming into my office at work, and there was a handwritten letter that was from a prisoner in prison who said, Dr. Hyman, I read your book in prison. I changed my diet, and I don't know how he did it in prison. He said, and I realized my whole life as a violent criminal was because of what I was eating. I feel like a completely different person. So
that is powerful, isn't it? That is so incredibly powerful to see the power of foods.
Yeah.
There is something going on in the UK at the moment, actually, which I'm just going to bring up here. And a lot of people are getting quite annoyed and very frustrated with the term food as medicine or food as medicine. It's really interesting. Yeah. And I know
they have a quarrel with Hippocrates, huh?
Yeah, I know my thoughts on it. And I think they're probably very similar to yours, but maybe it's just be a nice little offshoot here to touch on, these stories you're mentioning, the SMILES trial, this prisoner who wrote to you, all the countless case studies you've got and I've got, is food medicine?
Absolutely. I mean, there is no doubt about it. William Lee just wrote a book called Eat to Beat Disease, who's a Harvard physician.
Yeah, I'm not ready. I've seen it everywhere. I've not actually read that book.
It's really brilliant. But he showed a slide, and these very sophisticated analyses testing food components compared to drug components. So a blood pressure drug, a cholesterol drug, heart failure drug, whatever the drug is, and looked at various food components and how it compared in terms of the effectiveness, using very sophisticated models for testing these in biology. And they found that almost every single time food beat out the drug in terms of effectiveness.
Wow.
And what food is far more than calories, as I was talking about. Not all calories are the same. That's the biggest myth that's perpetuating everything. Because in the fast food world, if all calories are the same, it doesn't matter if it's KFC or soda or French fries. As long as you balance your calories, it doesn't matter what you eat. That's not true, because food is information. So we know that food influences the body in multiple ways. One, it changes gene expression. You literally can turn on or off genes by what you eat. If you eat broccoli, you can turn on genes that help you detoxify and produce glutathione, right? If you eat green tea, drink green tea, you increase the level of catechins, which have the ability to detoxify heavy metals and activate various enzymes. If you eat the right foods, you can balance your hormones. If you eat the wrong foods, you eat too much insulin, your testosterone goes down. If you eat too much sugar, if you eat the right fats, it's the opposite. If you look at what it does to your brain chemistry, it can either hijack your brain chemistry or it can make you calm and peaceful in your mood. It can change your microbiome. You literally have trillions of bacteria in your gut that control almost every function of your body. And when you eat the wrong foods, you grow the bad ones that make you sick. And when you eat the right foods, you grow the good ones that make you healthy. So literally with every bite in real time, you're changing your biochemistry, your physiology, your genetics every single minute of the day.
Yeah. Yep. You're absolutely right. I mean, it is that powerful.
I mean, this is not my opinion, by the way. This is just hard science.
Yeah. And I would extend that out. Of course, we're talking about food, but even sleep. There's really good studies showing that a single night's sleep deprivation changes the expression, I think, of over 700 genes.
Yeah.
You know, that if you haven't slept well, the genes that actually predispose to inflammation, the pro-inflammatory genes get turned on, and the anti-inflammatory ones start getting switched off. Yep. So our lifestyle literally is medicine. It's not just prevention of health problems. It can often be used as the treatment as well. And that's something that I think is still not recognized enough. It always comes down to prevention. And of course, prevention is better than cure. Sure. But you can use lifestyle a lot of the time as treatment as well.
As like the story with Janice. I mean, we weren't preventing her heart failure, preventing her diabetes, preventing her high blood pressure. We were treating it with food and with lifestyle. So yes, food is medicine, exercise is medicine, sleep is medicine, stress reduction is medicine, connection and love is medicine.
Yeah.
These are all medicines.
And
they work well, better than drugs.
And most importantly, this is the medicine we need primarily for the health problems of the 21st century.
Yeah.
That's the key. Maybe 30, 40 years ago, maybe we didn't need these things as medicine in the same way. Maybe our conventional opinion of medicine, like a drug that we prescribe, if you've got an acute problem and you come in with that, I can understand where that rationale has come from. But the health landscape of the US, of the UK, has changed dramatically. So we now need these lifestyle tools as our medicine.
By the way, twice as many people die from chronic lifestyle diseases as infectious disease, not just here, but globally.
Yeah.
So even in Africa, they're suffering the double burden of malnutrition and obesity.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. It's slightly ironic in many ways. And I think not calling food medicine, I think, is doing our patients a disservice, because then it's not put on the same level or a higher level than, let's say, the pharmaceutical drug that we might have to offer. And I think that's the danger when we don't talk about it in these terms.
I mean, listen, what happened to Jess? There's no drug on the planet that can do that. There's no drug on the planet that can reverse your need for insulin in 3 days, or can reverse your heart failure, or can reverse your kidney failure. They just don't exist.
Yeah.
And food can do it. And I've seen it over and over again. I may sound like a crazy man, but the truth is, this is actually what the science shows, is actually what people who are using food in this way see all the time.
Well, you don't sound crazy. You know what you sound like? You sound like someone
a little crazy
who has been practicing medicine for many years. How many years now?
32?
32 years of seeing tens of thousands of patients. You have seen firsthand the impact, and literally, you just sound someone to me who's just very passionate. You've seen it. You've seen the structural problems, and you want to take on something that not many people are taking on. You're not writing another book. You've written many great books, but this feels very different to me. This is taking on the political structure, the economic structure. You're looking at food in a different way. And I think that's very, very important. And I want to thank you for that, because I think it's very important that this sort of message gets out there. Coming back to systemic change, and we talked about making the food environment easier, and we're talking about prisons. I want to talk about schools. So I'm a father, as you are. I've got 2 young children. They're both at primary school at the moment. And what's interesting for me is that while my kids are a bit younger, they're currently 9 and 6, I was okay at sort of, I wouldn't say controlling, but I could sort of control in many ways.
Lunch, you feed them breakfast, you feed them
what
dinner.
They're eating.
Yeah.
And as my children are getting older, particularly my son now who's 9, and he's been exposed to more and more things, it's getting harder and harder. So this may be controversial to some, but I'm going to share my view on this. So on the final day of school last year, before the summer break, a lot of the teachers brought in Haribos for the kids.
What's that?
So Haribos are a very popular food make, certainly in the UK, of sweets, candy, basically.
Okay.
I don't know if they're here, or you must have an equivalent here.
Yeah, probably.
But these are bags of sweets that are very, very common. Now, the the reality is my kids don't eat that stuff because I've never given it to them. Now, you know, a lot of people will probably say, well, that's too brutal. You need to expose them to this sort of stuff. And, you know, I, like all parents, I'm trying to do the best that I can. This is what I consider to be the best decision. Maybe time will tell that I was wrong, but I'm certainly trying to do the best that I can.
You should have given them more junk food.
No, but it's about trying to teach them a balance. And I just think the norm in society is so skewed away from health at the moment that fitting in with what is quite a sick society, I don't think necessarily is biologically normal. I don't think it's the right thing. And so I'm trying to protect my kids as much as possible. Now, Jamie Oliver has been involved with trying to change various things in the UK. I helped him with his last campaign about junk food advertising. And I think that's something that is different in Europe compared to America. We do have some regulation around that. Maybe it's not perfect, but there is something still there. Now, at the last meeting, I was down in Jamie's office where a lot of opinion makers were there. We were discussing things. There was this whole idea of schools being a safe zone came up. And for me, I really like that. It's something I've been talking about for years, that essentially a school or a hospital or even a prison, right? But let's get back to schools, particularly schools. I think schools should be the model educationally, but also health-wise. I genuinely don't see why there is a case in 2019 and 2020 why, when we're facing this chronic disease epidemic, when in the UK, 1 in 3 kids leave primary school to go to secondary school at the age of 10 or 11 are either overweight or obese, I find it very hard to justify the case now where any school should be serving these sort of these sweets, sugar sweetened beverages, packets of sweets, because what that also does is it normalizes the food. It allows us to start associating reward and doing well with sweet food. And you know what? I had difficult conversations with my son. And my son said to me, "Daddy, why is everyone having a Haribo at school? I mean, you've been telling me this isn't very good for my health, but why is everyone giving it out?" And so what does that do? This is another problem which is not getting spoken about enough, Mark. Is that if you are a parent who is trying to do the right thing with your children, you're then making your children social outcasts because they're not engaging in a society that is actually engaging in a lot of unhealthy behaviors. I'm confused. Help me out, Mark.
Well, you know, I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in the United States, schools have been infiltrated by the food industry. 80% of schools have contract with soda companies. 50% of schools sell brand name fast food at lunch. McDonald's, Burger King, Domino's Pizza.
In schools.
In schools.
I mean, I don't know if happens in the UK. If anyone knows about that, please tweet me and Mark and let us know, or let us know on Instagram. That'd be super interesting.
I went to a school,
but I'm not aware of that.
I went to an underserved school in Cleveland, and it was a poor African American Hispanic school. 43% of kids are absent. 1% by the time they graduate are qualified to go to college. I walked down the hall. There was a young girl, very overweight. One hand, she had a 32 ounce, like a liter slushy, and another 32 ounce or a liter soda in the other hand. And, you know, these schools have fast, food in them, and they have deep fryers and microwaves in the kitchen. I walked through the kitchen. There was not a stove. You couldn't cook food. It all came out of boxes, packages, processed food, so burgers, fries.
Clearly, this is a problem. It's a problem for their health. But
there's advertising in school. So in the bathroom stalls, there's like Coca-Cola ads. I mean, it's everywhere in the schools.
Where I see the problem, Mark, is that yes, that's bad for their health, but I think the problem's deeper than that, because what that does is that it almost ingrains the kids,
of course,
in a certain way of thinking.
Hook them while they're young. Hook them while they're young. Absolutely. That's the science of what they're doing, and they're deliberate and intentional about it. And there are schools that are fighting back. There's, for example, a friend of mine who's created a program with the schools to rehab the kitchens, to get local chefs to create great recipes that are within the school lunch budget and the school lunch guidelines, and has revolutionized the Boston City School District. And the mayor is now involved, and they literally have transformed schools and getting these kids eating real, whole, healthy food that they love.
What about the parents who say that actually our kids should be allowed to these sweet treats at school. It's too draconian not allowing them to have this at school. What is your view there?
Maybe they should just give them a few lines of cocaine in school along with their lunch, or a little heroin booth there where they can get a shot of heroin. I mean, listen, the science is so clear that these foods are harmful, they're deadly, they're addictive. Why would you give them to your kids? Yes, you can have a sweet treat. Yes, you can have sugar, of course, but make it from real food. Yeah. Not ultra processed food that's going to hijack your brain and your metabolism. Make a real cookie from butter and flour and sugar. That's fine.
Did Michael Pollan say, eat whatever you want as long as you make it?
Right. So you want French fries, make your French fries at home.
Yeah, because it's different when you're making it yourself.
Right.
And I think the problem also for me is if schools do this is that you take away a lot of the choice from parents. So if parents want to engage in a sweet treat with their children, actually, if they're getting loads of it at school, then they're already going past their daily quota, if you even agree with daily quotas. But you're then taking away that choice. And I feel schools should be safe zones. And then it's up to parents what they choose to do with their children outside school. That's the way I would like to see it go.
Absolutely. Schools should be safe zones. Your home should be a safe zone. I mean, there's, I once said to my son once said, I want to invite some friends over. He says, but there's nothing to eat in the house, right? What he meant was there's no junk food.
Yeah.
So I'm like, all right, let's go to the grocery store. And there's only one rule. You can't buy anything with trans fat in it. He went around and around and around, couldn't find one thing to buy. I mean, that's the problem. Yeah. So we can make a pizza at home, and we did,
Well, and that can be fun, right? We've done that with our kids. You make a healthy pizza.
Right.
You get the kids involved.
Right.
They put it in the oven. They're engaged with that. And I guess that's something we've not covered yet is you mentioned the political structure, the farming structure, the economic structure. But how important is teaching our children, teaching the population at large, one of the most basic human skills of all, which is how to cook?
Yeah. I just wrote a cookbook called Food, What the Heck Should I Cook? And a lot of the cookbook is about, there's a lot of great recipes, but here's how you can just learn how to cook with the basic skills that you can put ingredients together. You don't need a fancy recipe. And I think it's a crime that we have lost that. And it's not an accident. And this is where I talk about the food industry. In the 50s in America, there was a woman named Betty who was an advocate she was a home economics teacher, and she was an advocate for teaching families how to cook food and how to prepare food and how to grow gardens. And she was really creating this great movement. The food industry freaked out, and they said, look, they gathered all in Minnesota where the General Mills headquarters was. They bring in all the food companies, and they basically colluded to decide that we're going to make convenience a value. Right? You deserve a break today. Let us do the cooking for you. Right? And so they created a cookbook called the Betty Crocker Cookbook. Now, you're probably not familiar with this cookbook, but there was a cookbook. My mother had it. Pretty much every family in America had this cookbook. And the cookbook was basically recipes that included processed food. So it was like, take one bag of Ritz crackers and sprinkle it on your broccoli casserole, or add 1 can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup to this or that. And so they were insinuating processed food. And then they came up with TV dinners, and then, we moved into fast food. And now, we had basically 2% of meals eaten outside the home in the turn of the last century. And now we have 50% of the meals eaten outside the home. And we have generations who don't know how to cook. Really don't know how to cook anything. And it's pretty frightening. So bringing that skill back is critical. I mean, how do we teach our kids things that often are irrelevant in school, but don't teach them the 3 things that matter most? How to take care of your body, and nutrition and cooking is part of that. How to have healthy relationships, and how to manage your money. We don't learn any of that in school.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great place to sort of close down this podcast. Look, those are 3 great tips on what we should be teaching kids in school. So there's many teachers who listen to this podcast. If you can actually go back to your school, if you agree with those, let us know for one on social media. If you've got some new additions to that you think we haven't mentioned, please let us know on social media. We'd love to hear from you. But in terms of we all can make a difference, if you're a teacher and you go into your school, if you're a parent and you go into your school, and you have these conversations with the headmaster, with the parents' committees. I find the parents' committee sometimes actually quite problematic because the whole fundraising system around everything revolves around sugar, revolves around treats. My wife and I, literally, we were chatting about it just this past weekend. But this podcast, as we mentioned at the start, is called Feel Better, Live More. I genuinely believe that when we feel better in ourselves, Mark, we get more out of our lives. Mm-hmm. I always like to leave my listeners with actionable tips, things that they can put into practice into their own life immediately to improve how they feel.
Yeah.
Now, because of the topic we've covered today, which is basically what you've written about in your book, Food Fix, I wonder if we could do this in two parts. The first one is, if people feel inspired by what you said, I'd recommend for a start, people go out and buy this book, because I think it will really force you to re-examine what you thought about food. I think it is so well researched. You've clearly spent a lot of time delving into this, so thank you for that. But if people at home want to start making a difference to this structural food problem that exists, what are some top tips they can do?
Well, I think the first thing is, change your diet so that you're eating real food. Don't participate in this junk food culture. 2, make your home a safe zone. 3, we didn't talk about it, but food waste is a big problem. So make a compost bucket in your kitchen. You can have a home composter. You can have it in your backyard. You can have a garden. 4, if you're a parent, be a school activist. Get your schools to shift what's going on in there around healthy food. And there's a lot of examples of how to do that. 5, if you work somewhere, get your workplace to be a safe zone too. At Cleveland Clinic, the CEO eliminated any sugar-sweetened beverages from the campus. It's possible. And also think about, getting engaged with organizations that are making a difference in the food system and that are part of grassroots efforts. And there's a lot of them out there, and I detail them in the book. And then lastly, vote with your vote. Be an activist politically where you actually can make a difference. You look at the voices that are heard out there that make a difference. Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." And I think we should remember that, because our actions matter, our work matters. I mean, Greta Thunberg, the young girl who's like, raising consciousness about climate change. She's 16 years old. She's raising her voice. She's going up against the powers that be. She's getting attention. Each one of us can be part of that, whether it's in our homes, in our families, in our schools, in our workplaces, our communities, our faith-based communities. That's a place to start.
If you enjoyed that conversation, I think you are really going to enjoy this one about the impact of sugar on your body and brain.
When you consume sugar, you are poisoning your mitochondria. Sugar and cyanide do the same thing. This is the toxin.